A year or so ago, when I was 19, I was home alone and my dogs were in the backyard. I was on spring break. My younger brother was at his high school. Both of my parents and my uncle that lives with us were working. It was like early afternoon, 12 p.m. when I woke up and went to make my breakfast and stuff. I was watching a YouTube video while eating my scrambled eggs. I don't remember what the video I was watching was about, but I finished eating and went to sit on the couch for like 10 minutes, and then I had the sudden urge to go to the bathroom. I stood up and took my phone with me and started watching another video, closed the door, started doing my business, and at the same time my phone was at max volume. Then, all of a sudden, clear as day, I heard a woman hum outside the door. It sounded like a lullaby. Once again, clear as day, I heard it. It lasted for like 5 to 7 seconds, and I was dumbfounded. I always believed in spirits, ghosts, etc., but I thought logically at first that it could have been the video I was watching. So I rewound it to make sure. But no, that hum did not come from my video. Then I thought it must have been my mom coming home from work early because she does that sometimes. So I called out to her. I stood up, didn't even finish doing my business, opened the door and called out again to my mom, with no answer. I sat back down. I replayed the video a couple more times and once again made sure that that sound did not come from any video or any noise on my phone. So I finished up, flushed, left the bathroom, and looked around the house, checking to see if my mom had arrived and just didn't hear me calling. But she wasn't home. I checked on my 3 dogs, and they were just laying there like nothing had happened. Then I called my mom on the phone and told her what had occurred. She also believes in spirits and said not to worry. I told my brother, and all he said was, "Bruh." Then I told my dad, who is also a believer of spirits, but he takes a more logical view. Like, he makes sure that nothing natural could have caused it, before telling me if the spirit comes back to tell them to go away and ask for the lottery number. I don't remember when this occurred, but I'm pretty sure I was still 19 when it happened. But one night, I was going to bed. Me and my brother share a room. He's been asleep for a while, and I think it was around 1 a.m. You know, that stage when you're about to fall into deep sleep, but you're still aware of your surroundings. Like you can hear things as if you were awake. So right before I fell into that deep sleep, once again clear as day, I heard the same woman's voice. It wasn't my mother's voice, but this time I heard the voice right next to my ear. It was whispering something to me, but I don't recall what it said. But it was perfectly clear, and it was right next to my ear. I instantly woke up and opened my eyes, but there was no one there. I stayed awake probably for another 30 minutes under my sheets before falling back to sleep. I told my brother and my parents the next day of what I had heard, and my mom said that she would see what she could do. Legit, that was the last time that I heard the spirit. So to this day, I'm trying to remember what the spirit whispered. But I just don't know. I don't know if I had sleep paralysis, but this happened almost a year ago. I was sleeping, and then all of a sudden I heard loud bangs. I don't know if it was gunshots or fireworks. I just know it caught me off guard. And then all of a sudden I felt something hit my spine. I couldn't move my legs or arms. I was sleeping on my right side facing my wall next to the window. I kept my eyes closed and I tried moving, fighting whatever was holding me down. Tried kicking. I didn't yell even though I was about to scream so that my parents could come. But then I started to feel my legs again and kept kicking until I had full control back. I kept my eyes closed and fell asleep. I woke up in the morning, wanting to check and make sure that I didn't catch a bullet. But that only happened to me once. This happened to me back in 2008 when I was 14, so my memory is a little fuzzy. My mom, brother, and I drove deep into the sticks of Tennessee from Texas to visit. We were only staying for the weekend. My mom, aunt, and grandmother were talking, and I don't know how we got to this conversation, but my aunt was telling me how she heard about this abandoned church that was supposedly haunted. If you went to the church and took the stick that kept the door closed and put it somewhere else, when you came back, it would be in its original place. There was a statue of an angel, and if you shined a light in its eyes at night, they would bleed. She was spending the night at a friend's house, and her friend also had another friend over that she wasn't familiar with. Her two friends decided to go out to this church at night, in the early hours of the morning. It was pitch black because it's out in the country. They lay a Ouija board on the truck and start asking questions. Basically, some spirit named John says that he was murdered by a gunshot some year in the early 1800s. I swear in this town there are more dead people than there are alive people. I don't actually know that, but it sure seems like it. The last question that they asked was, "Where are you?" and the planchette flew off the board. They decided they didn't want to look for it. Part of me wonders if it's still at the church and where it would be. So they checked the gravestones nearby and found John. Then they thought that they heard a gunshot and ran back to the truck and went home. I said I wanted to go to the church. She took me, my brother, and my cousin who were the same age. It was about a 45-minute drive to get there, and the road that it was on was empty, nothing but grass. There was no way that you could walk there. Across the street was a field that went on for miles, and on either side of the church was just grass and trees. No streetlights. So when we get there, it's a one-room, white, little church. It's surrounded by trees toward the outside of the fence. The fence was black iron, and the opening was big enough for trucks to come through. We saw the creepy angel statue that my aunt had mentioned. We thought it looked like the Reaper. We pull up, and the gate is already open. Immediately, my brother and my cousin, who were in the back seat, were like, "Oh no, we are not going in there." And my aunt was saying, "Why is the gate open? I just don't understand." And I had my hand on the handle, and I looked at the gate, and I knew that something was waiting for me on the other side. I could see, maybe my mind made it up, but I didn't see it with my physical eyes. A ghostly white man with yellow, crooked teeth maliciously smiling at me. So I take my hand off the handle and say, "Okay, I want to go home." So my aunt backed out and went down the road a little bit further, and the closest thing next to us to turn around at, because there were little ditches on the side of the road in case it rains, was another graveyard. Not surprising. We passed by the church, and I wasn't expecting her to stop, but she did to take a photo with a digital camera, and the door was open to the church. We were all freaked out, and I swear I had this feeling like we needed to leave because something was going to chase us. When we got home, the three of us couldn't stop looking at the camera. The thing I remembered the most was that the treetops grew into a face. It looked like a big bald man with a crooked nose and a narrow chin. When my aunt got the picture developed, there were 4 orbs. 1 by the gate, 1 by the door, and 2 by the window. My brother and cousin swore that they had seen green eyes looking out of that window. I didn't sleep that night. I felt like something was hovering over me, waiting for me to fall asleep. I kept praying that nothing would happen. I tried watching TV to shake it off, but damn, there was no shaking it. I didn't sleep until I got back to Texas. That was my last night in Tennessee, and when I went back home, I slept with my light on every night for a while. And while we were there, I could just sense this unbelievable amount of hate from whatever was there. It was so aggressive and ready to attack. That feeling just pierced through you. That's my only experience. I will never doubt that there is a spirit world after that. My aunt sent me the picture, but I tore it up in 2012 because I was afraid that it would bring something bad into the house. I've always had some kind of interest in the paranormal. As someone who grew up in a religious household but has always struggled with the concept of faith, I think what's always drawn me to it is the idea of proof. Proof of something beyond this life. Proof that death isn't the end. So I guess that's what set me up for this experience. This was 4-ish years ago on an October night. This happened with 2 friends of mine who I'll call Jim and Lisa. I've known Jim since 2nd grade, and Lisa since high school. Lisa and I went to the same college for a bit, and we had a mutual interest in the paranormal. Given the time of year that it was, close to Halloween, we decided to go and do some ghost hunting of our own. I called up Jim, who also had some interest, and planned to meet up and drive to a local cemetery not far from where we were. So this place definitely has the spooky factor to it. It's on a residential road, but the section the cemetery is in is really wooded and separated from everything. It's set back on a hill, and carved into the hillside right up against the road are the keeps that they used to lay bodies out in when the ground was too frozen to do burials back in the day. Jim and I had scoped this place out during the summer during the day because it was close to where he lived, so I kinda knew the layout. We all met up and parked next to it. I had brought a voice recorder from school. I worked at the school radio station, so it was fairly nice. We started walking around and asked some innocuous questions. Lisa claims to be sensitive, which I'm skeptical of, but that will come into play a little later. As we were walking around, kind of creeped out, we walked toward the back of the cemetery. It goes fairly far back, so we were poking around reading stones with flashlights when Lisa and I could swear that we heard someone walking around near the middle of the cemetery. All 3 of us were together near the back, and there was 1000% not anyone else out there. Could it have been some college kids hyping themselves up? Maybe. It's hard for me to really confirm with hindsight whether we were being overly imaginative, but we were pretty sketched out. After about 15 to 20 minutes, we figured that we should pack it up. Lisa and I were kind of freaked out still because we were fairly convinced that something was walking around near the center of those headstones. She also kept saying that she felt like something was compelling us to leave, and that we weren't welcome. Jim was kind of indifferent and wasn't really noticing anything super crazy, so we started making our way down the hill. This is when a weird thing happened. As we were walking down the hill, I heard a stone skip past me as if someone had kicked or thrown it. I figured that it was just Jim, as he's apt to do that sort of thing. But as I looked and was about to say something to him, he was about 10 feet to my left. He definitely didn't kick anything at me. The weirdest stuff that we found was on the recorder when we got back. I want to make this clear, this was not a super windy night. There was a light breeze at best. But the recorder sounded like it was windy as hell because we caught a ton of what I call interference. It was really deep bass tones that sounded like the microphone on the recorder were being overloaded. The creepy part was that there were times where there was a rhythmic quality to it, like something was speaking but couldn't get through fully. I'd say it sounds like when someone's talking in another room with the door shut, where you can hear the noise, but not much in the way of actual words. I did get it on the other investigations with this recorder, but never at that level. So while it's possible that it could have been an issue with the recorder, I'm not entirely sure. We also got some really direct, creepy EVPs. Toward the end of our time there, you can hear me on the recorder saying, "Hey guys, we should go," in reference to the creepy walking sounds from the middle of the cemetery. During the discussion from the 3 of us, there's a moan that's pretty audible that no one heard while we were there. It sounded like something was upset that we were leaving. This was reinforced by a minute later when Lisa asked, "Do you want us to leave or do you want us to stay?" and a voice pretty clearly answered, "Stay. I want you to stay," which was creepy enough to hear in general, but the whispery quality to it makes the hair raise up on the back of my neck. The epilogue to this is Lisa claimed that there was weird stuff happening all around her house the weekend after we went. Banging on the wall, noises in the other rooms. Full disclosure, Lisa does have a bit of history with mental illness, so I guess you might could chalk it up to that. The part that gives me pause is that we were talking about this at school one day and her sister called from the house complaining about all the weird crap that was happening. While I think her sister also has some sort of history, I think it's mostly anxiety-based, but I'm not 100% sure, honestly. I do find it a stretch that her sister would call and make a big deal out of it if stuff wasn't legitimately taking place. I only wish that I'd gone to the house and experienced whatever it was firsthand just to see for myself. I was born a twin, but my twin sister died at birth. So did all 6 children my parents had after me. Those died pretty early into the pregnancy, so it was mostly miscarriages. My twin was the only one who took a few breaths before passing. I'm the only one who survived and grew up to be the adult I am today. I only lived in one house during my entire lifetime, until recently when I got to finally move out. There's good reason for that. I learned about my siblings, especially my twin sister, when I was 14 years old. But when I was a first grader, I would wholeheartedly believe that I wasn't an only child, and tell my teachers and the other children about my sister who I was playing with and sharing a room with. By the way, I don't have actual memories of this, because no one was there. But I didn't lie for attention. I genuinely believed that. I had a fair share of trauma and mental illnesses in my life already, so when I started to hallucinate disfigured shadows and children in my house at age 12, I went to see a therapist, and it was deemed a symptom of my PTSD. The shadows would form a kind of uncanny young girl's shape most of the time. Until recently, I just discovered these hallucinations were side effects of my admittedly fragile mental state, since the encounters really scared me. Sometimes it even felt like it would talk to me in a weird, unfriendly way. They stopped at the age of 14, when my mother finally told me about my siblings. But still on the staircase to my room and around the dinner table where those things appeared, I would feel watched or even chased, especially at night. Sometimes when I'm awake late, I hear footsteps up the stairs to my room, but they just stop in front of the last step and don't go back down, but seem to start from the bottom again a few minutes later. This changed when I got together with my boyfriend. He started sleeping over and spending more time at the house naturally, and I never told him about my scary encounters. So when we were still up at night and the footsteps occurred, which I had learned to ignore quite well, he looked up from his phone screen, clearly alerted, and my stomach dropped. He's a skeptic, so after he mentioned how the sounds were weird, he quickly got his mind off of it. A few weeks later, my boyfriend went to the bathroom at night. In the morning, he told me how weird he felt walking up the stairs. He felt like someone was watching or chasing him. I never told him about how I always felt this exact thing when I walk up those stairs. Those occurrences with him started piling up, until I got genuinely terrified of staying longer than necessary in that godforsaken house. Right after I turned 18 earlier this year, I started working my hardest to afford to move out. And I finally did it last week. So far, I haven't had scary encounters in my new home. Something is telling me that it was her the whole time. Since I was a child, she's been tormenting me. The way my skeptic boyfriend experienced it, the same exact way without knowing, convinced me. I am not crazy. I live near one of the oldest cemeteries in Portland, Oregon. It's pioneer era. The oldest graves are from the 1850s, and it's still active today. Funerals all the time. Anyway, I go walk and jog through there pretty often. I usually jog a couple miles, and then finish up with some wind sprints. There's a spot where it's straight for about 60 or 70 yards, so I'll do 8 or 10 of these things and then quit. The spot where I usually start running from is right near the grave of a young boy who was born in 1896 and died in 1902. I've done some research, and all of his family is actually buried in a different cemetery, so I always feel a little sad about it. His name is Carl, and it's weird maybe, but I talk to the kid's grave as I'm resting up between sprints. For whatever reason, that's the only grave in there that I've ever paid much attention to, and about the only one that I'd ever done any research on. Not sure why exactly. A couple weeks ago on Wednesday, I was doing my thing. I stopped at my normal spot, said hi to Carl, and instantly got this sickening feeling that I was in danger. I looked up at this tree, big old oak, branches around 1.5 feet in diameter. I was absolutely terrified, and I started running and got the hell out of the way. I was absolutely 100% sure that this branch was going to fall and kill me. I waited a few minutes, and came back over and started looking at this big oak tree and the horse chestnut right beside it. I couldn't decide which tree actually was going to fall, so I sort of blew it off as paranoia. Not really a credible premonition or whatever. The next day, on Thursday, I go for a run, avoiding that area. When I finished up, I went back and stopped next to Carl's grave. It was a little later than I usually go, mid-afternoon, and it's getting pretty hot out, so I wasn't really looking forward to running more. I didn't actually hear anything, but something told me you shouldn't go any further. So it's hot, I'm tired, I'm paranoid. I noped out and went home. The next day, it's Friday. I go back into the cemetery. A massive branch from the oak tree had fallen, knocked about 5 branches off of the horse chestnut. It all landed on Carl's grave and right on the part of the path that I usually jog on. Some parks workers were already cutting the trees up to clear the way. I asked one guy when it had fallen, and he said it had happened sometime on Thursday afternoon. I have no idea if I actually would have been there at that time at that spot, but it was weird enough to freak me out a little bit. Anyway, thanks, Carl. I'm employed as a policeman, and I work the night shift in a tiny little town. The population here barely breaks 1,000. Needless to say, I know the town well enough to be able to tell when something is wrong. Near the center of the town, there's the old school they used before they built the new elementary and high schools. The building is listed as a historical site and can't be demolished, but due to asbestos, renovations would cost the town too much to be worth the work. This school sits within feet of the public library, and behind it sits the town's fairground. It isn't an official fairground, but every year they had bull riding and small shows that they would put on for kids during the summer. With all of those details out of the way, I will explain what happened. I noticed the backlight to the library on, which is not normal since it wasn't on all night, and it isn't a motion light, so I parked on the north side of the old school grounds. I walked through the fence and had to pass the school to get to the library. I would stop every few feet and listen because the gravel was so loud. When I stopped the second or third time, I thought I heard a squeal in the school, like the sound of a door. At first I didn't think anything of it, since I figured I was hearing things. The town just replaced all the windows on this building, so I thought I wouldn't be able to hear the inside. When I investigated the light and found all the doors locked, I started walking back around to my car. As I passed by the school again, I heard a noise in the building again, and I stopped and listened. And as I shined my light, I noticed a basement window was broken out. So when I walked up to the window, I looked down and in, and didn't see anything. I kept walking, and I heard the squeal again. It reminded me of those bathroom doors in schools that the hinges always squealed really loud and echoed. When I came around the corner, I saw 2 cats roughhousing in the dirt. They stopped to watch me, and then both of them turned and looked at the door. I couldn't see for myself because it was around another corner. One hissed, and they both bolted away from the school, which put me on edge. I know this school is absolutely not in use, nor are there any plans to use this school anytime soon. Also, the local kids and homeless don't come here, ever. It's a landmark the city as a whole really admires, and there hasn't ever been an issue with breaking and entering, at least not for a long time. So when I came around the corner, I saw the door and I walked up to it to see what the cats had run from. I looked for other animals, but that didn't make sense because they looked up as if someone were standing in the window of the door. Not like they would if it were a raccoon or a dog that ran off without me seeing. When I looked in the window with my light, I could see a gigantic Raggedy Ann painted on the wall, and I assumed this was the kindergarten section or something. And then I stepped back from the door getting ready to leave, and I heard whistling. It wasn't really loud, but it was loud enough to make me stop. That little voice in the back of my head was talking now and telling me I was just hearing things, but the dude that likes the dump of fear of the unknown told me to go back to the door. So I went back and listened again, and I know it was whistling, and not like the squeak of an animal or an object from inside. It got louder when I came to the door again, and it had a tune, but I don't know how to describe it. So now thinking someone is in the school, I went around and checked all the doors, including the second floor door that I had to climb the rusty metal stairs that were more like a death trap to see in through. When I couldn't find a way into the school, I checked it all over again, and when I left, I couldn't figure out what it was. The whistling had stopped, and I even hung around outside for a few minutes without my light on, just watching, figuring out if someone was in there. They would eventually need to use a light to get around or to get back out, but there was nothing after 20 or so minutes. So I got in my car, circled the block, and parked down the way with my lights off to watch for someone to come out at some point. But no one did, and there haven't been any lights on. I know this story seems kind of boring compared to the others, but working nights gets you on edge. And for all the things I know I experienced before, this was in my top 5 bone-chilling moments while on the job. Moving from a small town to a large city at a fairly young age had to be one of the biggest adjustments I've ever had to make. I knew no one. I had no idea how different it really was. I had no reason to think about it before we had to move. Not only was the way of life much different, but so were the people and the experiences. There were so many more buildings, cars, and people in general. And the dangers that lurked only just began to come so real for me. I've always had strange things happen to me that couldn't be explained, but I would always just shrug them off. I would play it off as if I was just tired most times and making myself see things that were not really there. Besides, I had no one to talk to about these strange encounters, and I was a young teenager. Who would really believe these outrageous things that I would just seemingly come up with? The church-going family that we were just wouldn't allow for such nonsense. The Lord protects us from all evil, you know, that kind of jazz. On moving to the city, I eventually got settled after some time of rebelling. I was your normal, typical teenager, and I was angry because I felt like I had been made to leave my friends behind. I got into a lot of trouble and fell into all the wrong crowds. You know, the whole stereotypes that people have of teenagers. I seemed to allow myself to live up to that stereotypical standard. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I didn't care. I found myself in some sticky situations that finally led me to a friend that showed me that what I was doing wasn't getting me anywhere with my life. For this story, we'll call him Bob. Bob was an older man. He was, I would say, at least 12 years older than I was. I was 13 at the time that we met. He had moved in downstairs from us with a friend of his that my parents knew. We met while helping his friend move furniture out of his apartment to have his carpets cleaned. Fast forward some time and Bob and I became close friends. Yes, it was odd myself being friends with someone so much older than I was, but somehow it worked at the time. There was this cemetery that was up the street from our apartment complex. We would go there regularly to visit graves and help clean them and place flowers on those that were unmarked to show that someone still cared for these people. We would always go during the day. It was such a beautiful and peaceful place. There were many rose bushes, green grass, tall shrubs, and some really pretty water fountains spread out across this large piece of land. It was easy to just stroll around there all day and lose track of time completely. One day we came upon this one tall mass grave that was unmarked. It was so old that the headstone was crumbling, and the lot that it was on was caving in and had a hole about a foot or so deep just underneath the concrete slab. We were both curious about it and would visit the grave a few times this one week. We weren't sure what it was about this grave that drew us back to it each time, but we visited this person quite often. I can recall this time that we had gone later in the day. It was just an hour or so until it got dark. We were never there when it was dark because they locked the gates, and if they found you there after a certain time, they would kick you out. But they never saw us or bothered to tell us to leave. We were, of course, at this unmarked grave once again. Nighttime had finally fallen, and it was pretty dark. There were a few lights in the cemetery, but it was just a soft glow that filled the area we happened to be at. Bob and I wandered around that unmarked grave, and were admiring the other headstones around it. We just couldn't believe how old that they actually were. We ended up circling back, getting ready to head home. We walked back past the unmarked grave to say goodbye. I remember standing there on the side of the grave, where the hole was. I was just thinking, how could they not fix this, and wondered how far down that it went. Being the curious idiot that I was, I kneeled down next to this hole and decided to stick my arm into it. It was so deep that you couldn't feel any kind of gravel or soil below. I guess Bob had just kept walking, so there I was with my hand in this hole below this concrete slab. I stood up and went to turn around to walk toward Bob. He was a ways off in the distance, but I could still see him. Before I could take a step, though, I felt like my body wasn't moving. It was as if someone had a huge hold on me. I couldn't move, and I couldn't speak. I was stuck. Bob finally notices me standing where he left me and starts yelling for me to come on, but there was no moving for me, and I felt this grip just getting tighter and tighter. It felt like forever watching as Bob made his way back in my direction, going on about how he wanted to get home, how it was late. He was standing in front of me and looked at me like I'd completely lost it. He had been talking to me and asking me questions, and I, of course, could not move or make a sound. He reaches out to grab me to pull me along, and I didn't budge. As we stood there, he kept talking to me, seemingly thinking that I was messing with him, and he was laughing. Tears began to roll down my face. All I could think about was, how am I going to get this thing to let me go? Did I make it mad? I just kept apologizing in my head, saying how sorry I was for disturbing them, and that if they let me go that I would never bother them again. I'm assuming that they must have known that I was sorry for what I did. I drop to the gravel, and I quickly bolt up and take off running. I ended up leaving Bob behind. He came knocking on my door the next day to ask what happened. I had no idea how to even explain what I had experienced. All I know is that I have never bothered that grave again. At the time when this happened, I was around 12 years old, living with my mom in a run-down apartment complex. The building we lived in was the smallest of the three in the complex, and it was shaped like an L, with our apartment being closest to the inside corner on the shorter side of the L. To our right was one other apartment with another single mother and her son, who was much younger than me. Below us was a family with 2 kids that I was friends with, and the apartment above us was empty. It wasn't the nicest area, so after dark we kept our windows and doors closed and locked. The reason I'm going into such detail is so that you can understand why I believe that this voice didn't come from anywhere other than in our apartment. We were up late one night. It was around 11 p.m., and my mom was looking at something on her computer. She and I would typically stay up late hanging out together, so this was completely usual behavior. The computer was tucked into one corner of our quote-unquote dining room, basically just a patch of linoleum off from the kitchen, and our living room was to our backs. We didn't have the TV on, nor did we have any other lights on other than the one in the dining room itself. I can't remember what we were looking at, but I do recall this sudden feeling that we were being watched. Many things that I attribute to unexplained paranormal activity happened while we were living here, so the feeling of being watched was incredibly uncomfortable, but not anything out of the ordinary. As I was beginning to shift in my seat to turn and look around, we both heard a sinister male voice say, "Meow." Conversation level, neither a whisper nor a yell, drawn out in an exaggerated, almost lilting tone, as if it were mocking us. I would say it took around 2 to 3 seconds for this voice to finish, and in that time I was able to feel every hair on my entire body stand on end. We immediately spun around, me nearly falling out of my chair to the floor, both of us nearly hyperventilating in absolute terror. My mom said something about, "If you aren't good, get the fuck out," or something to that effect. I'm honestly not sure how I slept that night, or any of the other nights we were there for, but we never heard anything like that again. I was about 17 when this happened. I moved in with my father after living with my mom for most of my life. Behind his house is a trail in between our house and the neighbor's house. It's pretty unbeaten, but you can still find your way through it. At the end of the trail, there is a very small pond. The first time I walked back there, I found it very charming, until I turned my head to see a small porcelain sculpture of a boy sitting on a log. The paint had faded from years of sitting there. The shirt was still slightly colored, but the thing about the paint that bothered me most was his eyes. They looked so blank. But the most important detail to the story is the hands, or the lack thereof. His hands were nowhere to be seen. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a forgotten decoration put there by the neighbor long before I had arrived. The pond behind my house afterwards is where I would go and smoke weed while my dad was home. The sculpture never bothered me too much. That is, until the day that I touched it whilst I was walking around. I walked to the very back of the pond and further into the woods, and found a small, wooden, decrepit shack. I wasn't about to waltz in there and get shanked by a weirdo, so I left it as is. But I got a really sinister feeling from it when I turned my back to it. When I was making the return trip, I had to slightly lean on the sculpture as to not fall into the pond. When I say I've never felt something so sickening and evil, I mean it. I immediately let go and sat back in the small chair that I had set up, and began to smoke, thinking I'm just being paranoid. Then, as I finished my bowl, I feel something tug my hoodie slightly, so I jerked my head to see. Nothing there, and I just brushed it off as a branch or something, so I took a deep breath, leaned back in my chair, and looked up at the stars, leaving my arm dangling down off of the chair. Then I felt a small, cold hand wrap its fingers around my index finger. I nearly shit myself, jumped up and sprinted back to my house, leaving all my paraphernalia at the pond. Keep in mind, it's about 9 or 10-ish, so I'm tripping over branches and vines until I found myself back on my back porch. From there, I could hear several twigs snapping and footsteps crunching pine straw heading back toward the pond. I haven't been back since, and I'm not planning on going. Between that old shed and the small, handless sculpture, the whole area gives off bad energy that thankfully I don't think I've brought into my house. I'm going to preface this post by saying that paranormal experiences are not unknown to me. I have seen ghosts many times over my life, and my mom claims to have seen me playing with them as a child. She was a psychic medium, so I spent a good deal of my childhood around this stuff, but those experiences are for another time. This is just to assure you that I have had experiences with the paranormal before, and that what I experienced I consider to be abnormal generally, as most of my experiences up until now have been positive, or at least neutral. This was a few years ago in my very early 20s. I'm in my mid to late 20s now. I haven't had any paranormal experiences since a little while after my mom passed away when I was a teenager. I was starting to think the things I had experienced didn't happen at all. General denial. One night, on a whim, while driving around a suburb near my house, I managed to convince my boyfriend to come with me to the local cemetery. I was going through a bit of an edgy phase and thought that going to a graveyard at night would be cool. This is a cemetery in a big city, and it's extremely large. I didn't believe in ghosts hanging around in a cemetery, so I thought that it would be fine. I believed that ghosts usually hung around the places that they died, or places where they had unfinished business, and that it was very unlikely that they would actually be in a graveyard. It was sometime in October, but not Halloween. We got to the cemetery around 11:30 p.m. We had our phones with us and were using them as torches. We hopped the fence to the cemetery and began to look at all the graves, pointing out the most interesting ones and kind of just messing around. The place was completely deserted, as cemeteries tend to be at that time of night. We walked further and further in and entered a part of the cemetery where the graves were quite a bit larger and much older. By now it had likely been around half an hour. As we were walking down the path, my boyfriend commented that there was a strange smell lingering around, which was extremely weird, as my boyfriend cannot smell at all. He lost his sense of smell due to a bunch of infections and other problems with his ears and sinuses as a kid. I couldn't smell anything, and I have an above-average sense of smell, so we both just shrugged the experience off as just weird. Later on, I was looking at one of the graves when my boyfriend shook my shoulder and pointed at one of the largest graves a few meters into the distance. I'm terrible at knowing where people are pointing, but this time, I spotted it right away. It was a little girl, I'd guess around 11 or 12 years old. She had very dark brown or black hair that looked well cared for and quite long. She was sitting on top of the grave, with her legs dangling over the edge. At first I saw her wearing a lacy white dress, like a nightgown that a rich girl might wear. It looked old, but I'm no expert, so I couldn't tell you exactly how old, but maybe the 1900s, early 1900s? I looked away to look at my boyfriend, and when I looked back, she was wearing a different dress. All I remember is that it was red, because at this point I was super scared. Something about the entire situation felt wrong to me. I felt extremely fearful, and due to the fact that ghosts were very normal for me, this was extremely unusual. I would never feel unsafe seeing a ghost in the past. It was around this time that I noticed that the cemetery was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of bats, and there were a lot of fruit bats in that area. There were no other sounds of animals, and the air felt stale and stagnant. We just stood and stared at the little girl for what felt like an eternity, weirdly transfixed, and then we both ran for it, up the path at full speed. I turned for a second to see if she was still there, and she was gone completely. It made me run faster, honestly, and the whole time we were both dead silent. When we got back to our car, we sat there for ages trying to work out what we had just witnessed. We were trying to rationalize it, but as we have both had paranormal experiences before, we knew it had to be a ghost. For a few months afterward, I felt continuously like I was being watched, and had frequent nightmares about seeing the little girl in our apartment. I always felt uneasy. We eventually moved around 30 minutes away, and the feelings and the dreams stopped. I've since tried to research the ghost, but haven't had anything turn up, though there is a local ghost tour at the cemetery, and maybe the guide might know something. Ever since then, my paranormal experiences have been more frequent, and have been getting more unsettling and disturbing. My boyfriend has been experiencing things more frequently as well. The story I'm about to tell happened when I was little, so basically it's my mother's and my uncle's version of it. When I was 4 years old, I was really sick. I basically couldn't digest the food that I ate, so my body had no defenses. I even spent weeks in intensive care at the hospital. The thing is, nobody knew what was wrong with me. For a year, 3 different doctors were trying to figure out what was happening. They made me do a lot of tests, even for rare conditions, but they were always negative. My mom was completely desperate. In her own words, "You were gonna die before I could even figure out what was taking you away." One day, my mom was with me at my uncle's house. He's my dad's brother, and he lives with his wife, and the mom of his wife, who was like a grandmother to me. So this old woman told my mom that she was beginning to think that I was possessed by a spirit. I live in a place with a lot of esoteric beliefs and traditions, especially followed by the old people. She asked my mother if she remembered going to the cemetery while she was pregnant with me. At that moment, my mother remembered that she had gone to bring flowers to her father's grave on the day of All Saints. There's a legend here that if you go to the cemetery while you're pregnant, or with a newborn baby, the spirits will try to possess it so that they can get to live again. My mom and uncle threw me into the car to take me to a church known for such cases. They said that I was screaming and crying the whole way in the back of the car. "Let me get out, I don't want to go there." I didn't even know where we were going, or why, since they didn't tell me anything. My uncle was driving, and suddenly, we hit a traffic jam. He tried to slow down the car, and then he realized that the brakes weren't responding. He kept stepping on the brakes without the car responding until we were about to hit the car that was standing right in front of us. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. Then the car stopped completely, just inches away from colliding. When we were sitting still, the strangest thing of the trip happened. They both felt as if several people from the outside of the car were pushing the car, shaking it to one side and the other. I was still screaming. Long story short, we arrived to the church. I didn't want to come in, but I finally did. I was crying all the time. When we got out, I was in a much better mood. My mom bought me donuts on our way to the car. I ate one and then puked, but it was as if I had puked up something with sandy texture. Something completely dry. My uncle stopped the car and got me out in case I was going to keep getting sick. Suddenly, I did a strange sound. It was like a burp, but way too loud and deep sounding for a small 4-year-old kid. I have a story from about 2 years ago that really captivates me to this day. when I've told this story to close friends, they tell me it's straight out of a movie. I can't really disagree with that. This starts when I finished my first year of college in the Bay Area. I worked my ass off in school and I just wanted to have a wild summer, and I would do anything I could to get out of the house. My cousin was and is my best friend, and we basically did anything and everything together. When there wasn't anything to do, we'd take walks together around my rural neighborhood. I always lived near this old hospital, which used to operate as the biggest trauma unit in my area. Sometime when I was in high school, they shut the hospital down for some reason that I still don't know. It basically just sat there rotting for a few years before we found it. One day we were drinking a cold one and taking one of our routine walks and ventured away from our usual route through this peaceful, random field. We stumbled across this huge parking lot after making it out of the field, but it didn't hit me that this was the old hospital's parking lot that we had found. We made our way through the lot until we saw this massive building standing on the outside. The deteriorated banner said emergency room, and this was when we knew we had struck gold and stumbled across a back route to this abandoned hospital. We knew of this place, but we had never been here. We hadn't heard any weird, outlandish urban legends, nor had anyone that we knew been here before us. We pushed forward and checked out the perimeter. To our surprise, the first door we walked up to had a rock jammed in between the door frames so that we could just waltz right in. This was when it occurred to us that it could be a potentially bad idea if we got caught, and we could suffer some consequences. We agreed we would be quiet and respectful and make it a quick trip. This is where things take a turn. Or a few turns. We entered the building and it was the most deafening quiet that I had ever experienced. The sound of the door closing was like a literal bomb going off. Once the echo stopped from the door, it dawned on us that this place was straight up creepy. We walked slowly, but the floor is covered in glass, which makes even the smallest of steps sound like Bigfoot lumbering around a library. We found a patient room, which still had a bed inside. We stopped at the doorway to look in because the floor looked sketchy. Out of nowhere, from around the corner, we heard the faintest, slow, drawn-out whistling. I've never in my life stopped what I was doing so suddenly. I just stared wide-eyed at my cousin because even a whisper sounds like yelling in this place. We both have our feet planted to the ground, because if we move, then we too will make ourselves known. At this point, we both assumed there could potentially be a squatter or a guard of some sort. My cousin hand gestures to me that we have to leave and we can't just stand here because the whistling was obviously not going to stop. We turn toward the opposite of the corner that the whistling is at, and we're tiptoeing to a perfect silence. Then the whistling stopped. We freeze again, and we hear the glass crunching from around the corner. We start running. Once we get to the door we came from, we realize we didn't put a fucking rock in the door frame when we came in, and now the door is completely stuck. As we were trying to get this door open, the glass crunching is now running. We hear it until it sounds like it is dangerously close. I am horrified. We turn around to try another door and the noise of the glass is literally right in front of us, yet no one is there. No one. We book it to a door that says pharmacy and peel the door open. The pharmacy is completely empty except a single, perfectly placed and aligned landline phone plugged into the wall. The phone is off the hook and making a dial tone. The whole thing is so perfectly lined up and centered with the whole room, I've never seen anything like it. And the dial tone was so loud in such an empty place. There wasn't power throughout the hospital, so how was it working? I was in complete shock. We left and never went back. I had heard of some other kids going there at night. They told me that they also heard the whistling and thought someone was lurking in the shadows the whole time. It is a freaky world out there. Before my best friends and I were separated, one passed away, the other moved away. We used to ride around doing all of the haunted legend places within reasonable driving distances. Sometimes we would drive for a few hours, but most of them weren't scary other than the adrenaline-filled, hyped up, "Did you hear or see that?" that would cause us to get spooked. This one was different. Way different. We were just out of high school, probably 20 at the most, and we were looking for an actually scary place to visit. A lot of people we knew that we were into these kinds of things, so we would always get tips on where to go. There was the original 3 of us that day and another friend that wanted to tag along. After a little drive to our destination, about 45 minutes, we stopped at a Wawa to get gas and grab a few snacks. Like I stated earlier, we were all about 20 at the time, so we were all hyped up because we knew that spooky time was getting close. We'd always pick on that other friend that tagged along. Nothing harsh, but just, you're scared. So I believe it was me that said something along those lines that was overheard by a few people. It got the attention of other people in the Wawa, including these 2 creepy, older guys who seemed like they didn't fit in. Their clothes were all beat up and dirty, and they just didn't seem right for the area, and the time was probably 8 p.m. on a Saturday night. "What's the little one scared of?" asked one of them. I say little because the 3 of us are all abnormally tall. The shortest between us was 6'4", and he was normal, so probably about 5'9". We replied and explained how we got tipped to go to this road, because it's haunted. They replied that it wasn't scary, and if we wanted a real scare, we should go to this random road. I forget what it was called exactly, but apparently it's this random memorial statue for a plane crash in the middle of the woods, where crazy things are supposed to happen. We grabbed our stuff, didn't think anything of it. As soon as we left, the group started talking and decided to go with the other road that the guys had hyped up. I know, a typical horror movie what not to do. So we get to the entrance of the road, and already it did not disappoint. There were woods on both sides, not one street light in sight, and I remember there was this detention center off to the right, in the middle of nowhere. So the spooks already began from the moment that we hit the entrance. We decided to drive down the road and search for the statue. We noticed that there were trees cut down on the side of the road and laying parallel to the shoulder of it. We finally find the statue. About 5 minutes go by in silence, and we decided to enhance the scare factor by shutting the lights off. About a minute goes by and we see a shadow figure pop up from the statue. We all freak out as it starts walking toward us, but it was making movements that no human would normally be capable of. It was dark out, but this thing was black. It was darker than the woodsy sky, so we could make out some of it. It was huge. Like I said earlier, we were all extremely large compared to the average guy, but this thing would have dwarfed any of us. We decided to peel out of there and continue down the road, figuring that it would lead us out. Boy, were we wrong. About 3 minutes go by, and we hit a dead end, which in this case was an open spot in the woods with sand everywhere. The cutout was massive, but surrounded by forest. There were different cutouts, and ways to go from there, and I'm pretty sure the road continued after this cutout, but we were pretty deep in the woods by that point. So we decided to turn around and leave, obviously. After we turn around, we stop to just take in the eerie feeling. The other 3 guys were talking about the shadow figure that we saw earlier, while I happened to catch something out of the corner of my eye. About 40 feet away from me, I see what appears to be a white face, and then another, and another, all surrounding the car. The other guys didn't see them, and I'm rarely ever scared, but seeing me panic, they all knew that something was up. My panic caused them to panic. We then floored it far away from the sand turnaround. We get about half a mile down the road, somewhat near the statue, and pull over to gather our composure before we get out of there. When we stopped, I swear I heard the most typical ghosty ooh kind of noise. This was now turning into a movie I wish that I was never part of. We were really scared. After finding the way that we had come, we started heading back out. Remember those trees I talked about earlier? They were now laying in the middle of the road, blocking us in, as we all see the white faces or masks that I had seen earlier. Thank God my one friend, the driver, was good at driving and valued safety over his car. We drove on the edge of the woods and felt like we were defying gravity to speed our way out. The car was literally sideways on the edge of the forest. I mean, I could literally stick a single finger out the window and touch the trees. We all made it home safely that night. After doing research, we found out that that spot was notorious in that area for crazy things happening, such as body dumps and murders. Because of the shadow and the ghost noise that we heard, my head, heart, and gut tells me that that place is actually haunted. As previously stated, that place is famous for dumping bodies, along with the plane crash, so there's bound to be some spirits there. I think where we were that night was actually haunted, but we just happened to be there on a night when there were more things going on. I can't say for certain, but I'm 99% sure that we survived one of their setups that night. I'm 100% sure that I will never go back again. Last night, my boyfriend went into the room next to our bedroom to play video games while I watched Parks and Rec on my phone on low volume in bed. After an hour or so, he ran in and asked, "Is everything okay?" I stared blankly at him. "Yeah? Why?" He then said he'd heard someone wailing, loudly, and that it sounded like my voice. It couldn't have been Parks and Rec, because I wasn't watching an episode with any sound in it like that, not to mention that the volume was too low to be heard in the other room. It couldn't have been me because I was just chilling. Additionally, I had not heard any wailing sound at all. He said he'd heard it through his gaming headphones a couple of times, wasn't quite sure what it was, took them off, heard it a third time clearly, and then came to check on me. This is strange because a few nights before, I was feeling incredibly ill with severe chills to the point where I couldn't leave the blankets to get more blankets. I was calling for help, and he heard nothing through his headphones. They're pretty good at canceling outside noise, plus he plays the game music at high volume. So who was the wailing woman? So it was around May of this year when I was playing hide-and-seek with my family. When the game started, I went to the basement. But after a couple minutes, I was about to be spotted, so I moved to the bathroom, but went backwards into the bathroom. Keep in mind, I was facing the doorway, and that is when it started. When I heard the groans, I froze. They didn't sound human, so I knew it wasn't one of my family members. A couple of minutes went by, and I could still hear the groans, but built up the courage to run out of the bathroom. A couple of more minutes went by. I could still hear the groans, and I had to build up the courage to run from the bathroom. That's all I have to share. If you could explain what happened, then that would be great. My great-grandmother died in that house. It was built in the 1940s, and that basement bathroom was built very poorly. Although I've had several paranormal experiences in my life, I was always a skeptic. I try to debunk my own experiences. Like, what if I was just tired? There must be a logical explanation. However, this experience made me a believer. A few years ago, I visited my friend who lives abroad. We decided to go inside an old amusement park that had been abandoned years ago. As a kid, my friend had visited the place every week, so it was pure nostalgia for her. We snuck through a hole in the fence and entered the park. The place was taken back by nature, mostly overgrown and with small, swampy little puddles everywhere. We were nervous about snakes hiding in the grass, and about the big pack of feral dogs roaming the property. But the paranormal hadn't crossed our minds. Upon entering the park, the dogs barked at us, warning us to leave them alone, so we avoided the area where they were and went on exploring. We seemed to be the only people there. After a good 30 minutes or so, we stumbled upon an empty karaoke bar. The place felt off somehow, not like the other buildings we encountered. My friend explains that this building is not what it seems. Karaoke bars in her country are often a cover for alcohol consumption, which was illegal back then, and prostitution. She doesn't recognize the place, which is weird since she spent a big part of her childhood at the park. We figured that it must have been a bit hidden away from the crowds, since it was most likely linked to illegal activity. The moment that we entered the building, my attention was immediately drawn toward a creepy door with a broken glass panel. You could see that there was nothing on the other side, but somehow the darkness behind the door seemed more solid than the door itself. I stared at it for at least a good 15 seconds before I tell myself to stop freaking out about a door. While we explore the first floor, I hear footsteps right behind me. Thinking it was my friend, I turn around, ready to make a stupid joke about her creeping up on me, but she isn't there. I see her at the other end of the room, at least 8 meters away from me. I chalk it up to weird acoustics and don't tell her about it. Do you know that feeling you get when people are staring at you? That's how the second floor felt. It was as if we had walked into a crowded room, except that no one was there. Like on the first floor, the darkness of some unlit areas somehow seemed too dark, more solid. I became increasingly nervous, but I didn't tell my friend, since I didn't want to sound crazy. Soon, my friend stopped in her tracks, and said that she wasn't comfortable exploring any further. She later described that room as a quote-unquote black hole. She recalls feeling as if all her movements were slower than normal, and as if her brain were foggy. This was right above the door that freaked me out so much. Back on the first floor, we feel silly for even being that nervous, and we try to overcome our fears. I decide to open a door adjacent to the freaky door, which was easier said than done. The door was stuck, and I had to put my weight behind it to get it to open. We caught a glimpse of a small storage room before the door was slammed shut again. We almost made a run for it, but since we stubbornly didn't want to give in to our fears and be wusses, we took a few more pictures of the room before we left. Once outside, we rationalized it by saying that it must have been some sort of animal, a stray dog maybe, but we were not convinced. Opening the door took some strength, so what animal could have closed it with such force? There was barely any space between the open door and the wall, so I doubt that it could have been a person hiding there. We talk for a bit to lighten the mood, and we feel braver now that we're outside again. We decide to visit her favorite attraction next, the pirate ship. In the past, it would swing back and forth, but now we couldn't get it to move no matter how much we tried. We both pushed against it with our full body weight, but the ship just wouldn't budge. We take a few photos while we chat about my friend's memories of the park. All of a sudden, the pirate ship begins to move. Slow at first, so slow that I thought that I had imagined it, but then it started to swing more clearly. Since we don't feel the creepy vibes that we felt at the karaoke bar, we decide to stay and watch. After a few minutes, my friend remarks that we should head back soon, since she wouldn't want to be in this place after dark. Immediately after those words left her mouth, it got darker, as if it were suddenly twilight. Remember the dogs who barked when we entered the park? They had been quiet since they realized that we were not a threat. But now, they go wild, barking and howling in the distance. My friend and I don't hesitate, and make a run for it. We run through the dark, overgrown park while the dogs go crazy. It was surreal. Once we reach to the hole in the fence, we crawl out as fast as we can, and suddenly, we feel safe again. I swear, once outside, the sun was shining bright. We looked up to see if it was just a well-timed cloud that had moved in front of the sun, but we couldn't see anything. To this day, my friend is convinced that something told us to leave, since it got dark right after we decided to go home once it was getting dark. I don't believe in these kinds of theories, but feeling-wise, it genuinely felt as if we had went through some sort of gateway when we entered that area. As if it was its own little world. The contrast was just that big. Back home we talked about our experiences. Apparently we both felt uneasy in the karaoke bar long before we actually voiced those feelings. I told her about the creepy vibe I got from the door, and showed her a picture that I took of it when we first entered the building. She tells me she felt the same thing, and took a picture just before we left. Upon comparison, we realized that the door is cracked open a little bit in my photo, but in hers, it's half open. These photos were taken 5 minutes apart, and it seems very unlikely that someone snuck in to open it while we were on the second floor. The dog pack was in a different area of the park, and there was no wind that day. I don't have an explanation, but given our other experiences at the park, this creeped me out even more. Like I said, I have experienced strange things in the past, but nothing like this. In the hour that we spent at that park, I went from a skeptic to a believer. I would love to go back someday and see what happens. This was a pretty surreal experience for me, and the few people that I've told agreed that perhaps someone was watching over me and warning me. A couple of years ago, I lived in a place close to the sea. At night, I used to take my dog down through the town center to the seafront for a nice walk. I eventually discovered that there was a small graveyard with gates on either side which I could cut through. I kind of like walking through graveyards, especially at night, because it is creepy in a very cool kind of way. I did this quite a lot, and never once felt afraid. However, one night I was walking up to the gates, and I felt the strongest feeling of dread. No reason for it. Nothing was different. But it was like something was screaming at me to not go through. Do not walk through the graveyard tonight. I didn't. I turned around and went the other way. It was such a bizarre sensation, given that before I had walked there plenty of times without meeting anyone, with nothing happening. I genuinely believe that if I had ignored that and walked on through, something would have happened. Who knows what, or what was lurking there that night. I never went that way again. Some people have told me that I had a guardian angel who was warning me of the danger. This story took place in the mid-2000s in Malaysia, when the Nokia 3310 was still a thing and teenage idiocracy was the ruling personality. I was only 14 at the time, and while introverted, I had a group of friends who were mostly in their late teens and early 20s. While this may seem unusual, it is somewhat common for Malaysian teens to have friends with considerable age gaps. One day, this group of friends decided to visit some abandoned flats and condos from a failed development project. The reason? They wanted to try their hand at ghost hunting. Not wanting to be called a coward, I naturally took up on their little excursion. It was planned that we would visit these supposedly haunted buildings on a Thursday night. The night rolls around and there we were, 20 people, including myself, arriving at the abandoned flat. The flat, darkened by grime with windows missing, presumably detached by junkies to be sold for some small change, loomed over them. Group by group, we entered, flashlights drawn. As I recalled, it was around 10 p.m. Slowly we made our way up the floors, exploring each unit, calling out to whatever might be residing there. The men's group had splintered into their respective groups, their hushed conversations, callings, and the occasional bouts of snickering and laughter echoing throughout the apartments. I stayed close to my group, not taking the chance of losing sight of them for even a second. For about 2 hours we were exploring, calling out to whatever ghosts or spirits we believed were making this flat their home, but we received no reply. At this point we were tired, bored, but most importantly, hungry. After a couple of calls between the heads of each group, it was decided that we would end the night and go have something to eat. So off we went, a small convoy of cars to the nearest restaurant. As we arrived and settled in, again in our own little groups, we ordered our drinks and food and started shooting the breeze. The topic about the abandoned flat was initially on the table, but was quickly dismissed since we never found anything interesting or experienced anything ghost-related at the location. That is, until one of the restaurant servers marched up to our table. His face was stern, and he was pointing at the younger kid who was sitting quietly, minding his own business, and he asked, "Who are you?" No reply. Again he asked, in a louder, more demanding tone. At this sudden outburst of questioning, we were all stunned, and had our focus to this server and that kid who was still keeping quiet, with his expression blank. The server turned to all of us and asked, "Where were you just now? Where did you drive from?" A guy from my table told him that we had just left that location. The server looked at us, and still with his eyes on us, pointed to the kid he was questioning, and asked all of us, "Do any of you recognize this kid?" 19 pairs of eyes shifted toward the quiet kid, and it hit all of us at once. None of us knew him. We made a head count and totaled 20 heads, including this kid. My group leader asked the kid's group leader if he recognized him, but he said no. "But you drove him here, right? You were with him, right?" they were asking. "Yeah," he said, "but I don't know this kid." At that, the server turned to the ashen-faced group leader and told him that his friend was still at the flat. He said, "You go return this thing, and you find your friend. Only you and your group. The others cannot come unless you want someone else to be switched." We shifted in our seats, and after what felt like an eternity, the guys at that kid's table got up, went to their car, with the kid following them without asking or invitation. Even after food and drinks arrived for the remaining men, any appetite that we had before had dissipated. The rest of the story was told to me by my friend who heard it from the group leader with the quiet kid. When they returned to the flats, they swept through each floor, every unit, and every room, looking for the missing kid. The thing that switched places with the kid? The entire group dare not look its way, as it tailed behind them while they searched. They felt its presence as they climbed the floors, sensing it growing more and more incensed as they neared the top. It took them about an hour before they found who they were looking for, passed out in a room on one of the upper levels. When they found him, they felt the malicious anger of the presence vanish, and then they mustered the courage to look over their shoulder. The kid was gone. They didn't hesitate in getting themselves out, not even bothering to fully awake the passed-out kid and ask about his condition. One of the bigger guys grabbed him and they all ran, each of them praying to whatever they believe in to protect themselves from whatever resided in that abandoned flat. They got to the car, practically throwing the kid they found in the back seat, and after the engine sputtered to life, the driver buried his foot into the gas pedal and they sped away. As I recall all of this, I remembered a conversation that I had with one of my Malay friends who is a little serious on matters of the occult. His stance when it comes to them: we don't disturb them, they don't disturb us. So don't go snooping around in their territories. This is the story of the time I saw an apparition that looked as if it crept right off the silver screen. This encounter happened in the late summer, early fall of 2007. I was in the 4th grade and my family had just moved to the absolute boonies of Mississippi. I was born in Mississippi and still had a lot of family down there, but my father had been stationed in another state for the previous several years. Military. So I guess you could say we were moving back home. My parents were in the market to buy a house, but until they found one, we would be staying with my great-aunt and her family. My aunt had a beautiful but slightly run-down 100-and-something-year-old home in the woods on the outskirts of an abominably small town. In order to get to her home, you had to drive down a 1-lane dirt road through the woods. On this particular afternoon, my sisters and my cousin, who was about our age, were playing tag in the front yard of my aunt's home. Now, you need to know a little bit about the layout of this yard. The yard was longer than it was wide. Picture a rectangle with the house on one end and the dirt roadway at the other end of it. If you're looking at the house from the road, the right side of the yard is bordered by muddy soil, thick trees, and bamboo that creates a sort of natural border to the property. On the other side of the yard is a length of tropical leafy bushes about waist-high that run from the front of the porch almost down to the road separating the yard from the driveway, just on the other side of the plants. Near the road in the middle of the yard was a ginormous old oak tree dripping with Spanish moss. Now back to the game. This particular round of tag, I was it. My siblings and cousin were running around the yard and the house, trying to hide behind various things. As I was scanning the yard, I noticed the figure of a girl with long, straight brown hair, peeping her head out from behind the big oak tree. She was wearing a dress that fell below her knees, which was very different from what the rest of us kids were wearing, namely cut-off jean shorts and stained t-shirts. I thought it was odd to see someone there, since I could have sworn that I saw all of the girls run in the opposite direction toward the house, but I figured I would go and check it out anyway. As I made it to the tree, I looked behind the trunk, and there was no one there. I was beyond confused at this point. My 10-year-old brain didn't immediately jump to ghost. It was more along the lines of, who the heck was that? The tree was in the center of the yard, with no other trees or shrubbery within 20 or so yards, so if the girl would have run up from behind the tree, I should have seen her. By that point, I started scanning the yard, and my eyes happened to fall to those tropical bushes that bordered the driveway. Crouching down near the bushes was the same figure of the girl. I remember her squatting near the leaves and peering in my direction when I noticed that she had no face. She was completely absent of any facial features, eyes, lips, and nose. Her face was just a smooth expanse of flesh-colored skin. It looked like something straight out of Silent Hill. I must have looked away, and then she was gone. I have never seen this apparition since. Now, I honest to goodness recall this encounter just as I have described above, but it was also 14 years ago. It's quite possible that my memory is faltered in some aspects, or as exaggerated in others, but this is how I recall it. Either way, it was terrifying. It was my last year of college, and after getting dumped by my first significant girlfriend the year before, I ended up involved with a woman who lived next door. It was not a healthy relationship for either of us, but I think we cared for each other despite not always being good to each other, and we somehow stayed involved for like a year. One morning while we were brushing our teeth and getting ready for the day at her place, she mentioned a video assignment due in a couple of days. She grew up in a large city and was unfamiliar with the sleepy New England region that we went to college in, but she knew that I had gone to high school about an hour away and had family in the area, so she was hoping that I might be able to suggest somewhere interesting to get footage. I suggested that my parents were buried in a pretty cemetery near the high school in town, and that I hadn't stopped to pay my respects for a bit, so I'd be happy to drive her over there after classes. She liked the idea, and we agreed to meet up in the afternoon, grab some dinner, and go by the graveyard so that she could take her footage. Only we kind of screwed up. It was probably late fall by that point, and the days were getting noticeably shorter. If I remember right, service was slow at the restaurant, too. By the time we were getting into my hand-me-down Dodge Grand Caravan to head out to the graveyard, the sun was going down. Not ideal for shooting some quick, amateur footage for video class. As I said, the graveyard was near the high school, which was a little outside the town proper. You passed the school, and then there was this windy road kind of into the woods and up a sizable hill or small mountain overlooking their football field. About halfway up, there was a turn off into the cemetery. It was a peaceful little spot, and my grandparents had plots next to each other. I had visited a lot in the daytime in my first couple of years of college. My grandmother had passed away when I was in high school, but my grandfather lived on a few more years until passing away early into my first years of college. Since I was nearby, I visited him a fair bit as his health began to decline, and in retrospect, I really value those opportunities to spend some one-on-one time with him, even if I feel a little guilty for not appreciating it at the time. I was a snotty 19-year-old and didn't realize what a cool guy that he actually was, and how lucky that I was to be part of his life in that way. After he died, I continued to stop by the cemetery several times a year to check on their grave sites and pay my respects. I had been to the cemetery a lot, but never after sundown. There were two entrances. The main one that took you through the center of the graveyard, and a side entrance that led out onto a little road, just big enough for one car that was a straight shot to my grandparents' plots. To the left of this little gravel road was an open field with newer-looking graves, and to the right was a more overgrown area with older-looking headstones, and the real tree line for the woods beyond that. Even in daytime, because of the brush and the shade from the trees, it always looked dim off that way, and my sister and I had both remarked about how it was kind of creepy over there. So this woman I was seeing and I were driving to the cemetery at sundown, just hoping that we'd be able to get in and figure out how to get some footage for her assignment. The main gate was locked, but the side entrance was open, which was better for us anyways, since it was the more direct route to my grandparents' graves. I pulled the minivan in slowly, careful to stay off the grass as much as possible, and we stopped and got out at the intersection nearest to where my grandparents were buried. She got the camera she had checked out from the school's library equipment room, and was trying to get some footage of the headstones or something while I walked over to say hi to my grandparents. Only it was too dark, and after a couple of minutes she asked if I would turn the headlights on to see if the light would help her get something usable. Not knowing how long we'd be out there, and not wanting to drain the battery, I decided to just go ahead and turn on the engine, too. After a few more minutes, the van started acting weird. It wasn't a new vehicle. My parents had bought it before I was in high school and had given it to me years before, so I was pretty familiar with the sound of the engine idling. That night in the graveyard, the engine began to make unfamiliar noises. It was very high-pitched and loud for an idling vehicle. That immediately raised concern for me because the last thing that I wanted was for the van to break down in the middle of the cemetery where we may or may not have been trespassing. I started to walk back toward the van to investigate. As I walked toward it, though, the headlights began to flicker rapidly. It was sort of an inconsistent strobing effect, which was like a what the heck kind of thing. They had never done that before, and never did it after. Same with the engine noise. Then I heard something even more disturbing. To my side, off in the wooded area with the older graves, something started moving around in the brush. I looked, and in the darkness, I swear, I saw movement to accompany the sound. I couldn't see what it was too dark, but something was coming slowly towards us out of those woods. I instantly felt as if it was time to go, and that we shouldn't be there. Fortunately, my companion agreed, even though she hadn't got enough footage, because she heard the approaching rustling as well. We got into the van, which continued to sound really weird, but thankfully it went into gear and drove normally as we got the hell out of there. The lights stopped flickering as I got turned around, and the engine sound returned to normal as we approached the gate. The most rational explanation for the rustling was an animal, but that didn't explain the van acting so strangely. I kept it for another 6 months before trading it in, and it never made noise like that while idling again, and the headlights were always reliable, never flickering. I also have had other strange experiences in my life, but this was the first and only time I ever felt that overwhelming sense that I had to leave or that I shouldn't be somewhere. I can't help but wonder if both my sister and I had always thought that wooded spot off to the right was spooky for a good reason, and if I might have found out what that reason was had my companion and I stayed for a few more minutes that night. My strange experiences started 4 years ago when I was in my room trying to sleep. It was 2 a.m. and I was bored out of my mind. I had a projector that showed me the time. Important. The anti-burglar alarm was on. My family was asleep. I sleep in a room next to the hallway door which leads to a living room. I heard the door open and the projector stopped working. It started working when I blinked. The day after that, it was around 2 a.m. again. I noticed something heavy sitting on me. It went away after a while. I had my head covered by my sheets, so I couldn't see what it was. Those days I saw shadow people out of the corner of my eyes. The worst one was when I was in the shower. I looked in front of me, and something pink just sped up in front of me in the air and vanished right into a wall. The happenings just went away after that, for a while. In the summer of 2017, I was sitting on my bed after lunch. I noticed the air around me felt thick and heavy, and I said, "Something bad will happen." It was August 17th, 2017. The day of the Barcelona terrorist attack. It was around 1500 hours when I said it. For some reason, those 2 hours until it happened felt like seconds. 2019. I'm back from my trip to Norway. I was taking a photo of a book that I had bought there when I saw a black orb while I was aiming at the book. I thought it was a sock. The ball vanished when I took the photo. A bit before going on my trip, I had been practicing soft combat with a few friends when part of the cardboard shovel I was hitting a friend with just vanished. No one else noticed. I had some more experiences with vanishing headphones and chargers, but nothing else. My most recent experience started a month ago, the day when high schools in Spain had to close because of the coronavirus. I was on my way home, and I had the bright idea of reading a prayer in a dark magic book that I own. A prayer against evil spirits. Bad idea. I own a few Solomonic books, and one of them warned against using black magic because the effect would be reversed. Since that day, strange things have happened to me. No shadow people, but what looks like shadow rabbits hopping into my walls. I see them out of the corner of my eye. I also saw a silver one. A huge crow vanishing into a tree. I mean huge, the size of a bike. A black iron bar floating near my window and then vanishing into a tree. I've also spotted what I think was a UFO. And they get weirder. 2 days ago, I was doing some work in my room and I saw a pair of shoes outside my window moving at a great speed. It was not my family. They were in the kitchen, quite far away. I checked again. No shoes. And just yesterday, my family heard me laughing in my room when I was working on something important and not laughing at all. I've been reading a book called Other Side Picnic about urban legends lately, so maybe it's affecting me. Another strange thing was the knocking on my window a few months ago. I heard it in my room and in the room where my parents sleep. It woke me up, but they didn't notice. It couldn't have been the wind. It was a calm day. It couldn't have been branches, as the trees are very far away. I live in Oklahoma, and I'm really big into finding abandoned places and exploring them. I found out a few months ago that there is a forgotten graveyard a few minutes away from my house. I've lived in Oklahoma my whole life, and I've never even heard anyone mention this place before. So I looked it up and did more research on it to make sure that I wasn't walking into something crazy or where I could possibly be harmed. I found out that it was the site of an old schoolhouse, and that there was no marker, so people had basically just forgotten that it was even there over the years unless they had a loved one that was buried there. I waited until daylight to go just in case, because I wanted to be able to see everything around me since I was in the middle of nowhere. I ended up asking my sister if she wanted to go with me so that I wouldn't be alone. And God, am I glad that I asked her to come, because I never thought I would have saw what I did. We woke early the next morning to go before it got hot because it was summertime. It was 10 minutes away from the house, so it was an easy drive. Finding the exact location was the hard part. Once we did find it, we pulled up and got out and started to look around. The grass was all overgrown, and you couldn't really see any of the headstones anymore. We had to be super careful walking around because we didn't want to step on anyone. We explored for about an hour or so, and then we stumbled upon this opening where the old schoolhouse used to be. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it sounded like someone or something was running right at us. But there was no one else around. And mind you, again, we're in the middle of nowhere. So we stop what we're doing and back up a bit to look and see. Neither of us spook easy, so we just looked around and we didn't see anything. We decided it was getting too hot to just stand out there for much longer, and so we started walking back to the car. Again, it sounded like something or someone was running at us, but faster this time. We both took off sprinting to the car and didn't stop until we got in and locked the doors. As we sat there, I looked up more about this place, and it's known by a few people to have major activity, and it's so bad that they actually tell you not to go at nighttime. I read stories of people who said they had seen figures walking around, or someone asking them for help and then disappearing a few minutes later. I'm glad that I decided to wait until daylight, and that I asked my sister to come with me, because I don't know what I would have done if I heard someone that I couldn't even see running at me if I were alone. I've never been back to this graveyard. It actually kind of scares me to even think about going back after what happened. When, though it wasn't anything serious like some of the other stuff people had said happened to them, maybe one day I'll have the guts to return. My girlfriend and I often get bored with our hometown, so we travel our state a lot exploring abandoned places. Some of these places are also deemed to be haunted. I'm browsing on my computer one day, and I find this prison located about 3 hours away from us. We decide to drive out there on the upcoming 4th of July because we figured that no one would be there for the holiday. This prison was very large, with 10 or so buildings ranging from cell blocks to indoor workout areas. All of these buildings were surrounded by guard towers and fencing that was impossible to enter without breaking the chain links. We parked behind these trees in the front parking lot and walked up to the main building entrance used for prisoner intake. Lucky for us, the front door was simply opened, and we could have just walked right in. We passed through that building, and here we are now inside the prison itself. It's a very large, open space with sidewalks and courtyards connecting the buildings. However, there were little things that seemed off about the whole place. Dead crows that lined the sidewalks were the most noticeable. It was like they flew over the prison and just fell out of the sky. Even the graffiti was made up of weird symbols that we didn't understand. We passed all that a little on edge now, and as we walked, I saw letters on the buildings. A, B, C were regular cell blocks. When we passed B, I thought to myself that we should check it out because B is the first letter of my name. Odd thought to have, but I went with it. The cell blocks formed the shape of a T, and in the middle of the T was a guard station with a ladder leading them to the second floor if they needed to go up there without having to interact with the inmates. This upstairs area connected to a hallway that led to a boiler room and a door with stairs leading down the side of the building. I walked up those stairs and past the boiler room, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I got to this hallway. I shined my phone flashlight into the hallway, and even though it was daytime outside, my light only went 1 inch into this area. I felt myself shiver even though I live in the south, and it's 90 degrees outside. I ask out loud if anyone is here with us to make yourself known. I'm sure this was a mistake, but I didn't mean it negatively. I just felt compelled to say it. From this pitch-black darkness, I hear a noise that sounded like something scurrying away, such as a small animal. I figure that's all it was that made me nervous, when all of a sudden I hear footsteps full-on sprinting directly at me. It sounded like whatever it was had massive feet and could run unnaturally fast. I ran out of the building and down the stairs with my girlfriend right in front of me. We both looked at each other and determined that whatever it was did not want us here. We ended up walking around just a little bit more to other parts of the property, but we felt watched the entire time. As we departed through the front door, we felt better, almost as if we were being released from an unpleasant fog of energy. We had sage in the car and burned some, which also helped us feel better. I try not to think about it often, but I do wonder what we encountered. My late mother told me her ghost stories from a time when she worked as a charge nurse at a well-known hospital in my state. Please forgive me if the story is hard to follow, as she told me this when I was a kid. In the early 90s, my mother was fresh out of medical school and was fortunate enough to find a job at a prestigious hospital. The only downside of taking this job was the fact that she would be working the graveyard shift. A typical hospital night shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. A couple of months into the job, she found out that one of her good friends from medical school had gotten a job at the same hospital as her. Unfortunately for my mother, her friend had gotten a day shift. On this particular day, my mother's friend ran into some car trouble and couldn't get a ride home. My mom, being the helpful person that she was, told her friend that she could pick her up and take her home before her shift started. My mom picked her friend up and took her home. Her friend was thankful for my mother and insisted that she stay and eat some dinner. My mother couldn't turn down the offer as she had rushed out of the house to go and pick up her friend in the first place. My mom and her friend sat at the dining room table eating dinner. In front of the table in the family room was a large fish tank. Looking at the tank, my mother noticed that all of the fish were pressed up against one side of it. She wasn't really bothered by this, but asked her friend, "Did you forget to feed your fish today?" "Why?" "All your fish are out and pressed against one side of the tank." My mother's friend looked at the tank and laughed. "Maybe it's my uncle. The fish would do that when he would look through one end of the glass." "I thought you mentioned to me that your uncle had passed away when you were in medical school?" "Yeah, sometimes I think he's just standing there looking at the fish, or maybe I'm losing it." They both laughed it off and finished dinner. My mother thanked her friend for dinner and left to make it to work on time. My mother was less than a mile away from work when she saw blue lights in her rearview mirror. She thought to herself, was I speeding? Did I forget to signal? Did I accidentally run a stop sign? All of this ran through her mind as she pulled over. The police officer came out to the car and up to the driver's side window. He shined the flashlight in my mother's eyes and asked for her license and registration. And then, the usual, do you know why I pulled you over tonight? No, sir. Well, the person in the passenger seat is jumping around and clearly isn't wearing a seatbelt. How can that be? My mom confusingly looked over to the passenger seat, and of course, the seat was empty. The officer shined his flashlight into the car and froze. My mom turned to look at the officer, who was visibly shaken and pale. After a few seconds, the officer began to mutter, "No, no, not today," and slowly paced back to his car. In a flash, the officer took off. Must be Uncle, she thought. My mom arrived at work and started with her normal routine. The night shift didn't faze her until around 12 a.m. While finishing some patient paperwork, out of the corner of her eye she spotted someone walking around in a patient gown. Concerned, she nudged one of her coworkers to check on the patient who was wandering around in the hall. He got up, looked down the hall, and immediately turned around back towards my mother. There was no one there. Confused, she looked over the desk, and indeed, there was no one there except other nurses and doctors. At around 2 a.m., my mom had gotten tired and decided it was time to get some coffee. She got up from her desk and began walking to the break room. On her way to the break room, she spotted the patient, the same patient wandering around the hall. Not wanting to disturb the other patients and nurses, she decided to follow this patient. She followed them until they turned and walked into one of the rooms. She walked up to the room and looked in, expecting to find them. Instead, she walked into an empty cardiology room. My mother walked out and began to think that she was losing her mind. Before exiting the room, she looked at the room number and saw that it read 616. She wrote it down on a notepad and continued with her shift. When her shift ended, she began to put away her work in her locker and pulled out her notepad. She looked at it, and it read Cardiology 616. Remembering what had happened, she used the break room phone and called her friend. Half asleep, her friend answered. My mom began to explain what had happened to her and mentioned her experience with the police officer and her shift at the hospital. Finally, my mom asked, "How did your uncle pass away, if you don't mind me asking?" "Oh, he was having some heart problems and passed away from a stroke." "When you visited him in the hospital, can you recall what room he was in?" I think it was room 616. "I think it was your uncle I saw last night and this morning." "No kidding." My mom always told me that story, and she truly believed that she had seen her friend's uncle's ghost. Though the ghost said nothing to my mother, she could only ponder the reason why. My family lives near a very large conference center in northeast Georgia. Due to COVID-19, the conference center has been shuttered and abandoned since May. This is a sprawling property with over 900 acres of forest, lake, and wilderness, with a few large hotels and a dining room, auditorium, etc. It's been around for about 50 to 60 years, although my family has only been in the area since the 90s. My girlfriend and I decided to explore the property, since it's been abandoned for months now. The entrance is very securely gated. There's no way to get past the front gates without a bulldozer, so we walked through the woods, leaving the car at the top. We walked through the parking lots to make sure that no one else was there. The location is very remote, so it would be extremely unlikely that anyone would visit on foot, especially in the middle of the night on Thanksgiving. We got access through an upper exterior door, and we started poking around the main hotel. It was completely abandoned, but left in good condition. It was spooky, as the only lighting came from the red glow of the emergency exit signs. We looked in many of the other rooms, and everything seemed neat and orderly, like guests could check in at any moment. We reached the main lobby, and then we both heard it, and froze. We simultaneously heard what sounded like a music box playing deep within one of the halls. Neither of us believe in the paranormal, but we both froze dead in our tracks and looked at each other, our faces confirming that we were both terrified. We bolted as fast as we could through the upper door, making sure that it closed securely behind us, and fled on foot. The music 100% sounded like it was coming from a music box, but it was also vaguely metallic, almost like it was a different frequency than most music. Due to the way that it sounded, we ruled out that it could be a forgotten cell phone or a computer. This was not any type of alert or notification made by an electronic device. There's also no cell phone service out there. Usually, I can find a logical explanation for paranormal phenomena, as I'm admittedly skeptical about it. However, I cannot figure out for the life of me what that music could have been. There was no one else on the property. There were absolutely no signs of squatters, and there's no music boxes in the hotel rooms. They are all intentionally identical, so there would have been one in every room. Does anyone have any insight on this? We were genuinely terrified, but now I'm regretting not investigating further. This happened about 7 years ago, and still creeps me out. My husband and I were living in this little above-garage apartment that only had like 4 little rooms. It was built in the 1920s. There were a lot of strange occurrences in the apartment before this event, but I thought nothing of it. My husband was in college at the time working on his associate's degree. Neither of us was working. I had no cell service at this point, and my husband's phone was our only real working phone. I had a phone with no service on it except for an internet service called Magic Jack, so that I could call out when he was in class in case I needed help. If it went to voicemail, it would record everything. This is important to this story. One morning, he calls the Magic Jack line to check in on me. He heard the line pick up, then nothing but static. Next morning, my husband had woken me up before, as usual. It was a day off for him. He wakes me up in hysterics. Something had been captured on the line. He played it for me. There was a very clear growl, and then a voice saying what sounds like, "Leave." Very gravelly and angry. Up until this point, my husband didn't believe in the paranormal. He was made a believer that day. Have any of you had something like this happen to you before? How did it change your outlook on the unknown? I was driving with my daughter from Atlanta to South Carolina, and we were about 30 minutes away from home. I was very familiar with the area because I've traveled there countless times. As we passed by a church, my daughter said, "Did you see that lady?" I'm like, "What lady?" She explained that there was a woman walking among the tombstones in the graveyard. I'm like, "Let me turn around and see." Now, I had gone just a minute or so down the road before I turned around so that I was sure to see her. As we got to the church, I slowed down, almost to the point of stopping, and there was no one. I turned around and actually stopped in front of the graveyard, and nobody was there. Now, this church was very isolated. There were no other houses for at least a mile or two. We didn't see any cars that might have been broken down, and there were woods to the back of the church. Like I said, I know this area, so we think that it was the spirit of a woman who was buried there. You have to ask yourself, why in the hell would a woman be walking around in a graveyard at 3 a.m. in the morning? No houses for miles, no disabled car. Very spooky. By the way, my daughter sees spirits, and she's an empath. About a month ago, I started a new job doing security at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was pretty much shafted with the night shift right off the bat. Normally, I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays, and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the weekends. It's a nice job, good pay, plenty of overtime. The campus doesn't have dorms, and I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and very quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and patrolling the empty dark halls can only be done for so long before boredom really starts to set in. When I first started, I had the expectation that I would be given the worst shift at the worst times, and I was right. I was put on the night schedule before I even got to see the place, really. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls until the late 60s. It isn't particularly secluded, but more suburban. It sits up on a hill overlooking a highway. It has 5 floors in the new part of the building, 4 floors in the old convent and chapel wings. It was first opened in the 1890s by a religious order of nuns, particularly for young ladies who also wanted to be nuns. It grew out of that until eventually attendance dwindled, and it was sold to the state, who in turn converted it into a community college after almost a decade of disrepair. I'm not someone who dabbles in the occult or knows a lot about the supernatural. I mind my own business and try to do my job. But recently, this place has got me in rare form. I don't scare easily now. But just in the short time that I have worked here, I've started to think that something is up. The security cameras are typical CCTV cameras. No audio recordings. But in the monitor, I'll hear a crackling like static. There's no way to enable or disable audio on the monitor. It comes and goes. I'll hear footsteps, like leather soles clopping down the hallways through the security monitor. When I go on patrols in the convent wing, the lockers that are typically reserved for the cleaning crew and faculty staff will be unlocked and wide open. I've seen them open on the cameras, but only my supervisor can play back the footage. Doors that I know I locked during my first patrol will then be unlocked and open on the 3rd patrol. The motion sensors will detect something and turn on when I'm not even on that floor, and when I am, sometimes they don't even react to when I move down the hall. And when I go to what is now the library, it used to be the chapel, I can hear piano music coming from the hall where I had just came from. I don't really drink anymore. I don't do any drugs, prescribed or not. There's no history of mental illness, and this isn't just a one-time thing. I'm not sure how to tell my supervisor about it without sounding mad or cowardly. I don't even know if I'm posting this in the right area. Only 4 more hours left in my shift, anyway. I always visit my son at the cemetery, usually at night. I love how peaceful it is there, and just look at the clear, starry sky. Today has been a rough day for me. I cried and prayed on my way to the cemetery. First, I noticed how bright that the moon is tonight. I usually have to use my phone's flashlight so that I could see where I'm going. Not tonight. My son has a toy box on his grave. Letters, books, and toys are inside. It's a little plastic tote. The lid wasn't there when I got there tonight. It was on the ground. Today's weather wasn't really nice. Everything must be wet, I thought. But no. The card and the letter that's sitting on the very top were dry. The teddy bear was dry. It couldn't have been the wind because the papers were there. I don't know if someone opened it and left it open, or something else. Nothing was taken, and nothing was moved. Tonight, I'm sitting here at the cemetery, totally at peace. I work at a mental health facility. Strange things happen a lot, like doors closing and opening, seeing things out of the corner of your eye. You know, normal, creepy hospital stuff. Well, I had the creepiest experience. One night about a year ago, I'm working on the adolescent unit, night shift. I just saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Then immediately afterward, this girl comes running out of her room screaming that the devil comes at 3:33. She's just repeating it over and over again. We get her some meds, and she goes back to sleep. The next night, it happens again. This time I look back at the clock, and it is in fact 3:33. They don't have clocks in their rooms, and they can't have watches, so there's no way that she knew what time that it was. We played back the camera, and she just went from dead asleep to balls to the wall. So this girl does this every single night for her entire stay, which was about 5 days. During that time, the quote-unquote creepy hospital stuff seemed to happen even more. Random door buzzers were going off, doors were opening and closing, lights were flickering. That creepy being watched, hair sticking up on your neck feeling was happening all the time. Every day she would say that she didn't remember getting up, and had no idea what we were talking about. About a week afterward, she got transferred to a long-term facility. I get called to receive a report for a patient that was being sent to us. I'm reading through the notes, and at the very end, quote-unquote, parents report patient repeatedly says that the devil comes at 3:33. I check the name to see if it's the same girl. It wasn't. I called the on-call physician, and he immediately declined the patient. To this day, all the staff have no idea what happened. Not very far from my home, there is an abandoned place, which is my hideout. I honestly don't know what was in the place before it became abandoned. The place is a rather small, probably like 40 by 20 meter fenced off, overgrown field with just one building. I can't tell what the building is either. It's a really small, house-like place with no windows and one locked door. The field itself has a small, short sidewalk that has been taken over by nature. There's also a small hill in the field. You can tell that the place hasn't been visited for a really long time, because the grass in there is quite overgrown, and the house, fence, and path all have plants growing all over the place. Since it's currently spring, a lot of the foliage is growing and blooming, and there were some wildflowers in the area as well. Today I took some scissors and went to the area with the intent of picking some flowers to make a cute bouquet to put in my home. As soon as I entered the area, something felt off, and I suddenly became paranoid. I ignored the feelings, since I have mental illness which causes me to have random paranoia at times. Keep in mind, though, that it doesn't cause hallucinations. It was still unusual for me to feel paranoid there, because I would usually go there to relax and be calm. It's basically my safe spot. I went on to look around and pick some flowers, but then I heard some footstep-like noises behind me everywhere that I went. I brushed it off again, assuming that it could have been an insect or a small animal like a hedgehog or a rabbit. I felt like I was being watched the entire time, but again, I assumed that it was just my random paranoia. The thing that scared me the most happened when I was about to cut a big, white, pretty flower. The only one of its kind in the whole area. As I was kneeling down to cut it, I suddenly felt a human presence behind me. This caused me to jump up, drop my bouquet out of shock, and yell out, "Whoa!" and turn around. To my surprise, nothing was there. I was very confused, since the presence felt awfully real. I picked up my bouquet and went home. This is a short story. I was maybe 4 or 5 at the time. It was November or October. I'm assuming it was October because that day my dad and I had bought pumpkins for us to carve for the first time, according to my memory. Before we began carving, my uncle and I were in the backyard. My sister and one of my cousins were playing in a pile of leaves beside me next to a tall green pine tree, and my uncle went inside to grab a frisbee for us to catch, and a camera to take a picture of us playing in the leaves. I remember when my uncle went inside, I turned around to look at the beautiful trees. There was another apartment complex behind our own. I remember the sun had started to set, and the golden rays had coated the green, freshly cut grass on the ground. I also noticed a young woman in a white gown in the yard across from me. She was bent over, and she was putting a flower into the jacket pocket on a little boy who was holding a white pillow. My uncle came outside, and I asked him, "What is that lady doing?" He smiled and said no one was there. He called over my sister and my cousin and snapped a pic of us. I instantly forgot about the lady in the white dress. Years had passed, and I had grown into a young woman. I had moved in with my boyfriend, and as time passed, it came time for us to move out of our apartment. As I was packing, I noticed a box that my dad had given to me when I met my boyfriend. I didn't open it until that time. It was pictures of my family, old clothes I used to wear when I was a little girl. I opened a photo album and looked through it. Then I looked more in the box, and I found a photo, the one my uncle took of me that day when I was a little girl. In the background, within the golden setting sunlight, I saw a woman in a bride's dress. I saw her features and her outline in the sunlight, but only in the sunlight. She looked happy, and she was bent down with both of her hands together holding something. The rest of her body didn't show up. I took the photo with me and visited my uncle, and as we sat down I pulled out the photo and looked at it for a second. I wondered if he would even remember. I then mustered the courage to ask him if he recalled that day. He faintly did, and I showed him the photo, and he smiled, remembering the days when we were all just little innocent kids. I pointed at the sunlight and asked, "Do you see it too?" He looked closer and said, "The woman?" I said, "Yeah. Do you remember when I was a kid and I asked you about the woman in the white dress, and you said that no one was there?" He replied, "Oh yeah, I see it. It must be a ghost." Anyway, that was my little short story. I travel to many different cemeteries for work in Massachusetts. I'm a grave salesperson and go to these cemeteries on an as-needed basis. One day I was finishing up a sale and decided to use the bathroom in the tiny office shed in the back of the cemetery. The door to enter the office was locked, but the bathroom door was broken and wouldn't close all the way. I didn't care that the bathroom door wouldn't really close because no one was coming into the office anyway. It was late and all the groundsmen had went home for the day. Just as I was finishing my business, the bathroom door slams shut, and since the knob was broken, the door just bounced and swung open. My first reaction was that someone had entered the office and the air pressure had sucked the door open. I run out and see that no one had come in. There were no open windows to cause a breeze. This door just slammed and opened all on its own. I was shaken up, but I still had some paperwork to complete. I acknowledged that there may be a presence in the room with me, but I didn't want to appear frightened of it. So I sat down in there for a few minutes and took my time finishing my work. Nothing has happened there since then, but I always acknowledge the entity as if it's watching over the place. One night, I was working a night shift in a refinery. I was working as a quote-unquote hole watch for my shift, which means I basically sit at an entrance and document anyone that goes in and out. Well, a guy showed up, I got his name, and he gave me the company that he worked for, so I logged him in. Everything checked out, so I'm waiting at the entrance for a few hours for the guy to come back out. Now, that's nothing unusual, because most of the people that go in will stay in there between 2 to 6 hours at a time, and every hour or two I yell up to make sure that they're okay. I would yell, and usually the guys whistle back or make a noise to let me know that everything's alright, and every time I check, I thought I heard a response. A few more guys came up to go in. I log them in, let them know that there's another guy up there doing inspections. They go in and radio back, "Hey, there's no one in here." Immediately I had a weird feeling because I was at the only exit entrance, so there's no possible way to get out of the container without me seeing. The way the container is set up, you have to climb up a ladder to get into it from underneath using a scaffold to help. I was sitting on the scaffold far back enough to where if anybody came out, they would drop down right in front of me, and the only way off of it was to go through the gate opening that I was guarding. So I radioed my foreman and explained to him what had happened. He got into contact with the company and they had no one by that name and no one scheduled to check that particular container. I was completely baffled at this point. Here I am, adamant as ever that someone went up into that container. I thought I was going crazy and I was also a little weirded out. I had a signature on the log where they sign in, and I have to sign right next to their name also, acknowledging that I know that they're going in. For about 20 minutes, I'm in full panic mode and freaking out because I don't have an explanation as to what happened, or where he went, or who he was. And on top of that, I could have easily lost my job because of it. I grew up in the country in North Carolina. I lived up in the woods where there used to be a water mill. A family lived there back in the 40s. The parents had 2 daughters and 1 son. Unfortunately, one of the daughters got caught under the water wheel and drowned. Ever since I was a kid, I always heard humming and low singing in the woods when I was out tromping around. But one thing that really scared me one night is when I was older. I worked for the sheriff's office, and I had left work early one night due to being over on my hours. I got home around 2:30-ish, and when I pulled up, I saw the figure of a little girl standing right beside my garage. When I got out of my car, she was gone. The next experience I had was when I was out hunting in the same woods. It was super quiet, a beautiful fall evening. I had just gotten down into my stand when all of a sudden I started hearing the same humming and singing I had heard multiple times over the years. But then I heard what sounded like someone walking toward me. I looked around everywhere and couldn't see anything. Then I heard a laugh, but not the same laugh as before. So as I was climbing down my tree stand, a rock hit my boot, and once again I heard the laughing. Now mind you, the area where I was hunting was about 3 miles deep in the woods, and there was no one around. I brought my brother and cousin and a few friends down there one night, and we were gonna just sit and listen and see if we could hear anything. We were down there playing cards, joking around, when all of us heard what sounded like someone in distress. We all got quiet and listened, and we could hear what sounded like someone breathing heavily. And the thing that confuses me about that night was if it was the little girl or something more dark. Sometimes I think things are better left alone. I work night shift on a unit at a nursing home. I hear and see a lot of weird things, but nothing much with meaning. Me and the other aide were walking down my hall to go check on a fall risk resident when we got in front of the door to an empty room that stays locked. The resident had moved home and no one had been in there since mid-October. I heard 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the room on the door as soon as we walked by. I froze and turned around, and without speaking looked at my friend, waiting for her to say if she had heard it as well, and when she did, I was frozen in fear, knowing that I was not alone in hearing things. Lots of little extra things have also happened. Me and another aide walked by a room when we got bad vibes. It was cracked open an inch, and the door slammed shut suddenly, so hard that it shook the floor. Right next to the room with the knocks, we had a resident pass away. Again, me and an aide walked by. The door was closed and locked, and the handle started jiggling hard and fast. Another time, me and an aide heard snarling growls coming from the dining room all night. The same night when the knocks occurred. There were also instances of running faucets in the residents' bathrooms, in the basement, anywhere that I went, had a resident complaining of water running all night. When I was 16 years old, I'm female by the way, my friends and I decided that it would be fun to go out to an old abandoned farmhouse that was rumored to be haunted. We didn't really believe in ghosts at the time, but were fascinated by the thrill of potentially experiencing something paranormal. So on a hot summer night in July, we decided to take 2 cars out to this abandoned place. There were 6 of us in total. It took about 45 minutes to drive there, so we left around 2:15 a.m. because we wanted to arrive at the farmhouse by 3 a.m., witching hour. To get to the house, we drove down a dark, winding country road with houses few and far between. There were no streetlights, so although it was a warm summer night, it felt incredibly scary as we drove through the unfamiliar place in the pitch black. As we arrived at the house, I nearly felt sick to my stomach. I didn't believe in ghosts or the paranormal at the time, like I said, but something in my gut just felt wrong. The house was situated at the bottom of 2 hills, and there was no driveway in front of it, so we had to park at the top of the hill where there was an area off to the side of the road, covered with crushed rock. We got there just in time to fulfill our plan of arriving at witching hour. As we walked down the hill, we saw the house. It basically looked exactly how you would picture an old abandoned farmhouse. Exposed gray wood, pieces of siding falling off, and old, overgrown plants all around the entrance. There were 2 levels to the house. The first level had 2 windows on either side of the door, and the top had 3 windows, one to the left above the door, and to the right. As we walked closer, we saw that the door was open, so we dared each other to go inside. We formed a line to enter. 2 of my friends, who were guys, went in front of me, and I was the third in line to enter the house. The first guy is friend number 1, the second is friend number 2. As we enter, I immediately felt ice cold. I have never felt that kind of cold in my life, as in, I felt it all the way in my bones. As soon as I felt it, I heard friend number 1 scream at the top of his lungs. It all happened so fast that I could barely make out what it looked like inside. I mostly remember an uninviting couch laid across the stairs with the living room to the left of the stairs and the kitchen to the right. It was like walking back in time. Old floral wallpaper peeling off the walls. So the second that friend number 1 screams, we all run out of the house immediately. As I looked back toward the entrance, I noticed that only friend number 2 exited the house behind me and friend number 1 was still screaming inside. Like blood-curdling, in fear, scream. Friend number 2 runs back into the house and grabs friend number 1 and pulls him out. My first friend was so scared that he ran from the house screaming that something was holding him up by the air by his shirt. He rips off his shirt while he's running, and all I see are 3 big tears in the back of it. It looked as if 3 prongs from a pitchfork had ripped through the fabric. But it doesn't end there. As my second friend stepped foot outside the door, he begins yelling in pain. I looked back, and he had blood dripping all over his face. I literally felt like I was in a horror film. He came toward me and I was in full instinct mode. I took my sweater off and gave it to him to try and stop the bleeding. He just yelled at me that something had hit him in the nose and that he needed to get to the hospital. So we run back up the hill, which felt like 1,000 years, to the car. When we get into the car, I get friend number 2 tissues and clean up his nose, and I shine my light on it to see what was bleeding. His right nostril had a clean cut all the way through it, as if someone had taken scissors or shears and cut it. And it gets worse. As we're driving away, my friend and I both look to the house, and there's a candle lit in the top left window. Then, as I look to the other side of the road, I still want to cry when I think about this. I have the image and feeling just burned into me. And there's this old trailer with a light on, and the silhouette of a man with a hat on in the window. I am 100% convinced that this old man was an evil spirit. Just the feeling I got of him staring at me, watching me as I drove by. I still feel the chills when I think about it. I felt like it was a warning to never come back to his property. Like he was the spirit that hurt both of my friends, and that he was sending me a message. On the drive back, we ended up bringing my friend to the nearest ER, where they stopped the bleeding and stitched up his nose. He still has a scar from it, and his right nostril looks as if it were dog-eared from where it split apart through the stitches when it healed. I work in a pharmacy that's located inside a nursing home, and I've been working there for the past 4 years. Just a note to mention, I've had many prior paranormal experiences in my life, but this is still ongoing. I've always felt a presence since the first week that I started, but it was never anything that made me feel threatened. Things didn't really start happening until last year, when I was talking to my coworkers about feeling a presence, and asking if that was something that they had experienced as well. The day after I had a conversation with my coworker, I was working a night shift. On our night shifts, there's only one technician and a pharmacist. I was sitting at the back counter on my computer when I thought that I had seen someone come through the door. We're usually not busy at night, but there is the odd time when one of the nurses will come down for a bag of chips or a pop. I got up from where I was seated and walked over to where our cash register was, and from there you can see the pop coolers and the chip racks. I couldn't see anyone, so I left and walked back and forth, looking down the aisles. Nobody was there. I asked my coworker if he had seen anyone come in, and he said no. But I was 99.9% sure that someone had walked through that door. I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I decided that I was probably just tired. I sat back down in my chair and started filling prescriptions. About 25 minutes later, I looked up and saw a pack of toilet paper slowly moving forward to the edge of the shelf before it dropped on the ground, startling me. There's absolutely no way that it could have just been our air system or a draft that had knocked it off. My coworker saw this too, and also thought it was odd. I told him it was a spirit that moved it, and he looked at me like I had 5 heads. So, to prove my point, I brought up the security camera footage. On the video, you can see 2 bright and fairly large orbs moving around as the toilet paper was being moved. I showed it to him, and there was no denying that it was a spirit trying to make itself known. That was my first significant paranormal experience at the pharmacy. We've had things go missing only to find them in the strangest places. For example, my car keys went missing one day from my locker, only for me to find them in with the prescription vials. My coworkers all swore up and down that nobody had hidden them there, and I most definitely didn't. Things are always falling off of the shelves, and sometimes they're heavy items, not just something light like the toilet paper incident. We had a 5-kilogram jug of Epsom salts crash onto the ground and break open, and no one was even remotely close to the aisle. Many of my coworkers and I see what looks like someone walking by out of the corner of our eye, only to realize that no customers are in the store. We also hear what sounds like the door to the front entrance open and close, and nobody is coming in. This happens multiple times a day, sometimes. The only time I've ever felt threatened or scared so far was when I was working the night shift and got locked in the bathroom. It could well have been a hardware malfunction, but I don't believe that it was. The handle locked from the inside, and I don't normally lock it anyways. I did my business, flushed the toilet, and washed my hands. I went to exit the seemingly unlocked door and felt that it was being held shut from the other side. I figured it was just my coworker messing with me, so I started yelling his name, and that it wasn't very funny until let me out. The handle started moving as if someone was on the other side, wiggling it. I yelled again for my coworker, and he must have finally heard me because I could hear his footsteps. He asked what was wrong, and then pulled the door open with ease. He's now finally starting to believe that I wasn't crazy, and that this place actually has some paranormal activity going on. I took my young kids to visit my grandparents' gravesite for the first time. They were really freaked out to learn that dead people were buried underneath all the headstones. The headstone kitty-cornered to my grandparents was for a small boy around 4 or 5. When I noticed the age, I heard a whisper in my ear to talk about the kid. As I said, my kiddos were already really freaked out. I didn't want to add to the experience of learning about dead kids. I heard the whisper 2 or 3 times before we left. When we got into the car, my son said, "Who was that boy standing next to Grandpa? He looked really sick." I instantly had chills and got super emotional knowing that my grandpa was there with him. I live in Lompoc, California. I also live across the street from the cemetery. I used to hop the fence on one side of the cemetery to go to a friend's house who lived on the opposite side of it. If I went around, it would easily be a 4 to 5 block walk to her house. The keeper of the grounds who lived there called the cops on me several times, so I stopped. I also have been driving for years now, so there's no need anymore. Anyways, on one of my walks, I noticed a tree house in the cemetery off to the side. It was in a trench in a deep wooded area. There's been a few nights when I've gone and hung out inside of this treehouse with a few friends. However, every time I went, I would see spirits. I was scared many times, but seeing my friends happy and enjoying themselves was what made everything worth it. Except for one night in December of 2018 when I had brought new friends with me. During this time I was going through a lot and kind of hanging out with a bad group of people, some of whom were with me that night. Like I've mentioned, I always at least see something, but usually only for a few seconds. This time, though, I saw a rather large man, kind of burly yet completely transparent. I felt him before I actually saw him, how sad and lost he was. But I could also feel how gentle that his soul was, and that he was only looking for help or just someone to understand. Since I could feel him, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. After the initial feeling, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. My friends heard it too. I looked over, and I saw this man, and all I could feel was how confused that he was. He started to walk up, but froze once I saw him. I yelled out to him that it was okay and that we weren't going to hurt him. I told him that it was safe for him to be there if he wanted to stick around, but then my friends wanted to leave with how freaked out that they were. I walked out first to be his guide, and he walked in front of me until he disappeared seconds later. I don't think I really helped him, considering that I didn't have much chance being with that group of friends and all, but I could feel just how gentle that he was, like I said. Sometimes I feel that gentle presence whenever I visit the graveyard, and I think of him. Today I went, because today is also the anniversary of me losing a friend. I felt that gentle presence when I visited her grave today. While going through a tough time in my relationship, I decided to move in with my mom for a few months for a break from the chaos. A guy I had met through a mutual friend of ours offered to pick me up in his truck and take us for a drive through the mountain trails behind my mother's house. Bored out of my mind with TV and food, I agreed. He arrived, I got in. We drove to the top of the ridge at the beginning of one of the trails where we stopped to roll up really quick. 5 or 10 minutes later, we were slowly driving along, listening to music, talking, laughing, realizing that we had actually been neighbors years before. The song on the truck radio was changing, and there began a softer song. We could hear the wind blowing quietly through the trees, and all of a sudden there was a whisper. "She's with him," the voice said, extremely clearly. I did not know what to do. I mean, what were they talking about? And even more importantly, who were they? We continued to drive down a trail a bit longer because my guy friend said it would be bad not to show dominance to whatever it was and not to run scared, ever. But it was, in fact, the scariest moment of my life. I should clarify also that this is in the middle of nowhere in the middle of nowhere. My mom has no neighbors for miles. Hunters are allowed on the property, but none were in the area. We shined headlights in the direction of the whisper, and there was nothing. My wife and I were camping last night in Blue River Reservoir in Oregon. We camp here often and decided to explore up FSR 520 and found a cool, abandoned bridge far back in the woods over Cook Creek. The spot was beautiful, and we were set up over the river on this long, abandoned bridge. If you've ever been in the Oregon woods, you know that they can give off a creepy vibe, and this was no exception, but it really was a dream campsite. Being 40 feet directly over a river while on a bridge with limbs growing everywhere over it isn't your everyday spot. I'll throw in for background that there was no one within at least 3 miles of us, and we had to hike our way in, approximately 1/10 of a mile from where we had parked. We explored around the area for a bit, and didn't come across anything out of the ordinary besides a pair of shoes and a name, Mona, written in ash on a rock of the fire ring. While we were sitting by the fire, I noticed a very bright flash of light over the river and snapped my head up, but didn't see anything. A few moments later, I was paying closer attention and watched a ball of light float, even with the bridge 40 feet in the air, from one side to the other in the woods over 50 feet. The light was very blue. My thought at first had been somehow that headlights had come through, but I would have heard a car and no man-made light could get to us in this isolated area. This blue light was unlike anything I had ever seen. I mentioned it to my wife, but didn't want to freak her out, so I dropped the subject soon after. Later that night in the tent, we had the mesh lining up where we could see outside. My wife gasped and watched as the same blue light floated at the end of the bridge 30 feet away and hovered in the air. After a good bit of time, it shot off into the woods. It being late at night, we were obviously scared of someone's headlamp, but it shot away 40 times as quickly as any human could go, and we saw nothing attached. Our dog left the tent and stared at that exact spot for the next 10+ minutes, while also peeking down the side of the bridge, very seriously. A couple of years ago, me and some friends had a short-lived phase of trying to go and explore as many cool, abandoned places as we could. One of these was a very old hospital that had been closed for roughly 20 to 30 years, I believe. It was pretty central, in a big town, so it was quite regularly maintained as far as terms of boarding up windows, doors, etc. to keep people out. Our first visit started with us climbing through a window near the middle of the building. We pried a plyboard board up from the window, but as soon as me and 3 other friends got in that room and opened the door into the main hallway, we agreed pretty quickly that we shouldn't be there and left. Unusual for us, as we quite clearly weren't scared of much if we were easily able to break and enter into a building in the middle of town. We'd also never been scared and anxious of anywhere before, and it's weird that all of us agreed that we should leave straight away. Our second visit is where it got properly weird. We went back about 2 weeks later, and all of the plyboard on the windows was replaced with metal sheets, which isn't strange for a building in a large town where people break in regularly, apart from the fact that the window that we went through originally was completely open. We climbed through anyway, and got all the same feelings again, except when we tried to open the door into the hallway. It was locked, and felt as if something was pushed up against the other side of it. We went back through the window, and I was last. As I was about halfway out of the window, I heard a young girl's laugh, pretty much directly behind me in this small room, and I nearly fell out of the window trying to get away from it. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me at first, until one of my friends asked if I had heard that laugh, and that's why I jumped through this window. All my other friends had heard it too, and said it sounded like it had come from inside the room. All of this is pretty normal stuff, and I'm sure that the door being locked or having something behind it was just someone moving stuff around inside if them and their friends were exploring too. The young girl's laugh that we all heard from the room we were in, and how we felt on both visits, is what we can't explain. I'm a corrections officer at a county jail in northwest Alabama. I work a 12-hour night shift from 1800 to 0600, 6 p.m. through 6 a.m. Most nights are calm and not much happens from 2200 through 0500, 10 p.m. through 5 a.m. And other nights, you're moving non-stop and police officers are constantly bringing people in. You have a lot of DUIs and junkies on the weekends, and then anything from an FTA to the occasional murder throughout the regular work week. Anyways, like I said, most nights are calm. meaning that hours feel like days, and sometimes a single shift can make you feel like you've been here for weeks. But sometimes, those calm nights are not really all that calm. We have 2 holding cells in the front of the jail used to house inmates that have been recently booked in, and are waiting to see the nurse for screening before going to Gen Pop. We have another room up front that we call the Pink Room, due to the walls and ceiling being painted a hot pink color because a former sheriff thought hot pink was a calming color. Everyone hates this room. It's our drunk tank, equipped with a camera for observation and a flushable drain in the floor for any liquids that might come out of someone, if you know what I mean. One night after lights out, when everyone was asleep, I heard a loud bang in one of the holding cells, like someone was hitting or kicking the door, which would have been a normal noise if anyone would have been inside one of them. But my partner and I had moved everyone out of the 2 holding cells just a few hours ago, and no one else had come in that night. I thought it might have been the guy we were keeping in the Pink Room for medical observation, but when I looked over at the monitor for the camera in there, he was sound asleep on his mat on the floor. I went over to the doors of the holding cells to investigate. I lifted the heavy curtains on the windows so that I could see into each one, but there was no sign of anything. I figured I was just hearing stuff since that noise is so commonly heard at all times of the day or night. I went back over to my desk and sat down. It was about 02:45 when I heard that noise, and it was completely silent until about 03:05. I started hearing the noise it makes when a door is unlocked from the control room. From the control room, you can unlock or open any door in the facility except for like 3 that you need an actual key for. There's a door right behind the desk that I sit at that leads to the kitchen and rec yard. That was the door that sounded like it was unlocked. I radioed my partner, who was in the control room, and asked if she had unlocked this door. She said that she hadn't touched the computer since I asked her to let me outside to vape like 2 hours ago. Again, I thought it was a common noise to be heard, the silence is playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, except this time it sounded like the front door. I looked over at the monitors for the front door and saw nothing, but on the monitor for the Pink Room I could see the screen start to get fuzzy, like static. Then it was completely black for a few seconds. When the camera came back on, the inmate was sleeping in the exact same spot. But everything he had in there with him, his cup, shoes, blankets, was all scattered across the whole room. I would have heard him moving and throwing things, but it was completely quiet for those few seconds when the camera was black. After that, I decided I didn't want to be alone anymore. I went to sit with my partner and started telling her what was going on. After I told her about the doors unlocking and locking and about the guy's stuff in the Pink Room, she just laughed and said, "Must have been Christine." My partner has been working here for 5 years now. She told me that Christine was an inmate that had died in the old jail next door, and that the reason she haunts this jail is because the buildings are connected. She told me about numerous things that have happened while she was on shift, including actual sightings of the ghost she calls Christine. She said that Christine has gray hair down to her shoulders, and that she's wearing a nightgown. She also said that Christine can be seen walking down hallways on the cameras, inside the cells with her hands on the bars looking through them, and that sometimes you can see her face from the windows outside. The first and only time I've ever seen a ghost, a dead person, a demon, whatever you want to call it, was exactly 1 year ago today. I had just gotten my bachelor after 3 years of studying social welfare and was now working at a group home for teens with substance use problems. My workplace was in a big old house, which was almost scary quiet during the nighttime, and I often felt anxious being there. Don't get me wrong. I really enjoyed the job and spending time with the teens, but working nights scared the crap out of me. I usually started my shift around 8 p.m. Around that time we often made dinner. I helped out with homework, and we talked for hours, dealing with all sorts of issues until I went to bed, usually around 1 a.m., and this was one of those days. I fell asleep at 1:30, woke up 2 hours later like I usually do to get a glass of water. I walked down the stairs, entered the common room, and then walked by a big window in the living room. I looked up at the gray, cloudy sky when I saw death hanging in a tree. Brown, rotten flesh in the shape of a face. I rubbed my eyes, and then looked again, and the flesh was still there. I couldn't move, breathe, or blink my eyes for a few seconds. I was absolutely terrified. After a while, I found the strength to move my legs, and walked into the office again. I locked the door and sat there all night. And when the sun finally peeked out, I managed to move my legs to go and look out the window again. There was no rotten flesh this time, just a normal tree with green leaves. A few days later after this incident, I told my boss that I didn't want to work night shifts anymore since the lack of sleep. I didn't want to tell her the real reason, since she would probably think that I was mad. Maybe I was. And what if this was just a nightmare? Probably. But what if it wasn't? A few years ago, I was on holiday in the south of France with my boyfriend, now fiancé, and his family. We stayed in a small village about half an hour inland. One afternoon, me and my boyfriend went for a walk around the village and came across a church cemetery, so we went in to have a look. It wasn't creepy or anything, as it was just daytime, and it was right in the middle of the village, and there were a few cars going past and several people walking around. The cemetery was interesting to us because it was different to a British one, as there were little tombs the size of a garden shed around the edge that were very old and had whole families buried inside. After walking around for a while, we walked up to one of the tombs that had no glass on the door and looked inside. You couldn't see anything odd in there. There was a cross on the wall and a vase that would have had flowers in it. But the smell and the atmosphere changed right outside that tomb. It made us both feel ill, like a sudden sense of dread overtook everything. The air seemed stale. We left quite swiftly, and I felt as if we were being followed after that, until we left the cemetery and got back onto the pavement. I was in a nearby abandoned Navy hospital with several friends. We had been in many times before and never had anything odd happen. We were on the top, the third floor, and there were many broken windows, allowing the rain and nature in. There was a lot of mold and even moss growing in the old ceiling tiles that covered the floor at this point. One of our group, prone to asthma and respiratory issues, didn't take it too well. We all decided it was best to leave and began our descent into the basement, which was the route to the exit. This is when things got weird. I broke ahead of the group, something generally against our rules of exploring, but in my mind I had to get out. I was far enough ahead, around corners and such, that I couldn't even see their flashlights behind me anymore. My heart was racing, and I still don't know why. I finally got to the last door that led to the room that we would exit from. It was a heavier door that closed by itself. I reached for the doorknob, but something stopped me. I couldn't do it. Something in my mind wasn't letting me put my hand on the knob. All I felt was terror. I'm not sure how long I stood there, shaking with my hand no more than 3 inches away, before I saw the flashlights of my friends at the end of the hallway, and at last I could do it. I wrenched the door open and immediately went outside, hyperventilating with panic. My friends soon joined me, also saying something felt a little weird in there that time. We were gathering outside the door when the friend with the breathing issues felt something on her shoulder. We pulled down her shirt and there was a noticeable, quite obvious handprint. Nobody touched her, especially not hard enough to leave a full handprint through clothing. We've been back several times and haven't had another experience in any way, which only makes it even more odd, if you ask me. When I was 13 or 14, I was staying in a hostel in Ireland. This hostel was directly next to, supposedly, one of the most haunted places in Ireland, an abandoned mansion. In fact, the hostel was built from the bricks of the mansion. There was a story that a widow cursed someone in there, and when they died, they remained. After hearing this, being a young and dumb kid, I decided to taunt the ghost. Big mistake. Nothing happened after I taunted the ghost until I went to bed. That night, in the very right side of my bed, I heard light breathing. I paid it no mind because I've had experiences before and breathing was not a huge alarm for me. I eventually fell asleep, and then I got a phone call on my phone at 3 to 5 a.m. Likely family from back home in the US. I didn't answer the call, and I tried to go back to sleep, but there was a problem. My comforter had fallen off the bed, to the right side of the bed, and the breathing was loud and raspy now. At this point I was frightened because I had never heard breathing that loudly before, and it just wouldn't stop. Needless to say, I didn't get my comforter out of fear, and it was a good thing that I didn't. In the morning I was shocked by what I saw. To the right of my bed was the comforter laying on the ground, and it looked as if there was a human underneath it. I could make out the arms, legs, and head. To this day, I genuinely believe that if I had reached for my comforter, something would have reached back. I was 14 at the time this happened. I had just moved downstairs because I wanted more privacy, as my parents were always checking in on me. I've always been a rebellious kid and wanted to be alone and do my own thing, without anyone telling me not to. I had always noticed strange things happening around my house, and I kept asking my parents if they were going through my stuff in my room. They would always say no, so I always brushed it off. These things still happen to me to this day, like things being moved and waking up in a cold sweat, with no explanation. One night I was on my phone and I felt this feeling of dread and anxiety come over me. I then heard a voice say, "It's okay," and I looked up and a black silhouette of a woman was standing at the foot of my bed. She had no face, but I could clearly see the outline of a petite woman just standing there. I remember feeling very scared, but also very calm at the same time. I was looking at her for 15 seconds before she vanished. I told my parents what had happened, and they were also scared because my dad would always say that he felt a presence in the house. I instantly moved back up to the main floor. I remember telling people about it, and I would always remind them that my parents built the house, so there were no previous owners. People have given the idea that it was my grandma who passed away a year before this happened. I still question if this is true. I've not had anything that intense happen to me again. I still have the nightmares, and also question what she meant. Why was it okay? I remember telling that to myself over and over. I'm thinking of moving back down soon, but for now, I think I'm good. I am a serious skeptic with decades of debunking behind me, but I have a few cases that cannot be covered by SP, sleep disorders, infrasound, carbon monoxide, etc. One personal account occurred a few years ago after my paternal grandfather died, though this was before I dealt with his estate. I was spending a week repairing the old maternal family Bible, a damp, damaged 17th century Welsh edition, so a tough bit of work, and I went to the living room for a break. On the exact spot I was born, old family, old house, was a fixed pillar of smoke. I was a pipe smoker at the time, so recognized it by color and character, and opened all the windows to clear this mysterious miasma. It didn't move at all, and had a distinct Tonkin bean scent. I couldn't name it at the time. The exact same one that filled the hospital room during final prayers for my paternal grandfather. I'm an ex-Methodist preacher, so that fell to me. The pillar was seen and photographed by 2 others. 3 weeks later, I handled the estate, opened a sealed room, and found a Tonkin-based pipe tobacco tin. I spent 12 years ruling out any way that I could have known that scent, and there was no other way or means that I could know it other than spirits held me at that moment that a life ended and supported me to catalog family history. Simple and odd, but interesting. It was 1999, and I worked night shift in a factory back in Puerto Rico. One night it was just QC and me working in a back dark room of the factory. About 2:30 a.m. I saw a door open, and a pale young lady stepped in and walked in our direction. QC was facing the other way, and I was looking at her from my workstation. I stood up, and that's when I noticed that from the waist down, the woman was blurred. She was dressed in a light blue dress and a cap. As she got closer, she vanished into a mist. I rubbed my eyes and called the QC. I told her what I had just seen, and she said, "It's just your imagination playing tricks." After an hour or so had passed, this tall, dark shape, dressed in a brown mechanic's outfit, got close to me, looking over my right shoulder. I could see it with the edge of my eyes. It wasn't touching the floor. I froze, petrified. For about 30 minutes, it kept moving forward and backward. I finished the work night and went home spooked. Next day I told my experience to everyone, and a mechanic who had worked there for years told me that when he stayed there, an old mechanic who had all kinds of issues was found hung in the same spot where I was working. So this happened a few months back, when I happened to be in the bathroom. I was singing that Willow Smith "Wait a Minute" song to myself, minding my business, you know. I got to the point in the song where she quotes a phrase said in the Avatar movie in their language, and while I'm singing it, I'm thinking to myself at the same time, I wonder what that actually means translated into English. And as I finished singing the line, simultaneously trying to recall what it translated to, a female, disembodied voice said, "No, you can't." I shut up immediately and paused for a second, shocked. It sounded as if someone were speaking into a tin can, but very clear and only a few feet away. I left the bathroom completely weirded out, and after a few minutes I remembered about wanting to know what the phrase meant. I googled it and found out that it meant "I see you" in English. I was, and am, still blown away by this strange experience. When I was about 4, I went to the local cemetery with my aunt. She went there often to take pictures because there were some pretty spots there. She was taking photos of my cousins and I ran off, and when they realized I was missing, they yelled for me. I came back and they asked where I had been, and I said that I had been playing with my friend Angel, and that I would take them to her grave. I did, and even though I couldn't read, I told them details about her that I wouldn't have known unless I had been able to read her headstone. Since then I've looked into the girl and found out that she's the sister of some people around my age, who I know in my town. She was 4 when she died. I still look for her headstone every time I go to the cemetery, even today.